The very first film of the 1920s is one I can't really get into since it's lost. But on January 9th in Germany, there was a film called Figures of the Night, or Nachtgestalten. It was by Richard Oswald, who would later work with Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau, and was about a mad rich man who keeps his son in a cage, and was based on a play by a man who later became a full-on Nazi, like literally a member of the Nazi Party in Germany. The first film of the 20s that we can see is also from Germany and debuted on February 26th there, and actually did get screenings in the US in 1921, and it's The Cabinet of Dr. Kagari. We're introduced to Francis and another man, and this woman comes through, and Francis states that it's his fiancée and that they've been through a tough time, and then begins to tell their tale. He tells of his hometown, and the wicked Dr. Caligari strolls in, and Francis has a friend named Alan.
Alan.
And I mean, just take a look at this set design. Dr. C strolls in and wants to have a booth at the local fair where he plans to show off a somnambulist, a sleepwalker, although who needs that when you've got this awesome monkey here? He presents his show, and people do go to see it, even with that freaking monkey nearby, but that night, the clerk that issued the permit is found stabbed to death. Francis and Alan go to the fair and walk right by the monkey like they don't even look at it. Jerks, but they do check out Dr. Caligari's show, which is a guy who says he's been asleep for 23 years and says he will awaken him in a trance. He unveils Cesare and invites people to ask him questions, and Alan just straight up asks how long he'll live, and it's like, hey man, he's a sleepwalker, not a crystal ball. But Cesare answers anyway and says that he'll die by the morning. And to further complicate things, both fellas love the same lady. And of course, when Alan is murdered that night, it's up to Francis to find out what happened and what exactly is in the Cabinet of Dr. Kagari. And this is an insanely influential film by Robert Wiene, and he started in film in 1912, and his works were highly regarded, and he kept working until the 30s. When the Nazis banned his 1933 film Typhoon, he went to London to try to continue his career and never returned to Germany, and only made one more film, and one incomplete one as he died of cancer soon after. Now, this film is often used to demonstrate the tenets of the German expressionistic film style that was happening at the time, but this is a far more exaggerated form of it. Everything is these weird off-kilter shapes, and everything is at odd angles, and there's a ton of shadows throughout. It was done in this manner as the film is told in flashback and is meant to evoke that you are seeing things through the eyes of a madman. Oddly, by the time that this film arrived, the expressionist movement was considered dead and overly commercialized, and very few other films continued the style outside of a few other Wiene works. Keep in mind, this was shortly after the First World War, and German films were still looked at with a bit of skepticism, but it did manage to get an American release, although it was protested in some places. It did really well in Germany though, and it's of course gone on to be considered one of the greatest of the era, and its visual style has had a heavy influence on filmmakers like Tim Burton. And there's been several pseudo-sequels and remakes, including the bizarre Dr. Caligari from 1989, and some stage productions as well. And this is just lovely. I give this 4 out of 5 reels. It's a weird and trippy story with a cool twist ending and dynamite visuals. Its significance is a 3.5 as well, since it's widely known and very influential, but not exactly a cultural mainstay, and is not something that's seeped into our everyday life. Should you watch it? Yes, sleepwalk into it. The next one arrived on March 24th and is our first American entry, and was entitled Love Without Question. It was by a man named B.A. Rolfe and was a mystery thriller based on a novel called The Abandoned Room from 1917, but is also currently lost. Next up, on April 4th, there was another American entry that arrived called The Dream Cheater. This was by Ernest Ward and was one of the last films he directed in his somewhat short career, and it was also based on a novel, this one from 1831, titled La Peau de Chagrin, but it is also lost. 1 month later, on May 9th, there was another one, This one from Paramount. It was called The Dark Mirror. This was by Charles Giblin and featured an actress named Dorothy Dalton playing a double role and involves a murder mystery. This is one that's not lost, but is currently archived away for preservation and is unavailable for viewing. Back over in Germany, and we have an entry that debuted there on July 8th, and it's called The Hunchback and the Dancer. This was by the legend F.W. Murnau, the man who made Nosferatu, and the cinematography was by Carl Freund, who would later end up in the US and directed the 1932 Mummy. It was about a hunchbacked man in love with a woman, and his jealousy causes him to sabotage her future relationships, and this is also lost. Here's one that debuted in the US on July 30th at a premiere party, and then started playing a wider run a little later on August 8th, and it's The Penalty. Here's this doctor, Dr. Ferris, and it's not his day off, and he screwed up while operating on this kid, and they have to amputate both of his legs, which is, yeah, kind of a big screw up. How would that even happen? Well, doc, this kid's here for an appendix removal. Wait, did you say appendix or legs? They cover it up and pretend to have it saved the kid's life, but the kid knows better, and then 27 years pass, and that boy is now the Lord of the Underworld and named Blizzard, and is played by Lon Chaney, the man with 1,000 faces. He's being hunted by the police, and their top operative is a woman named Rose, and he has a sweatshop operation and kills anyone that tries to leave his employ. So Rose decides to go undercover in his operation. Meanwhile, Ferris has now become the most successful surgeon in the world, and considering that previously he was accidentally just cutting legs off, I don't know how that happened. And he has a daughter named Barbara that is trying to sculpt a perfect bust of Satan. Well, Blizzard decides to make himself her model for the bust to enter her life and get his long-awaited revenge on her father. And this was by Wallace Worsley, which is a name that we'll see again in the 40s, and he and Chaney worked together pretty frequently. It was based on a pulp novel from 1913, also called The Penalty, by Gouverneur Morris, and a number of his works were adapted around this time frame. One crazy aspect of this is that Chaney truly does appear legless, and in order to achieve this illusion, he had to have his lower legs strapped up onto his back and walk around on his kneecaps, which was so unbearably painful that they could only stay that way for a little while, and earned himself some permanent muscle damage as a result. I guess that they were worried that audiences would think that the actor actually removed his legs for the role, so they included a shot at the ending of the film with him walking down some stairs. But that scene was later cut out and is now lost. However, there's still a scene in the film in which Blizzard envisions himself leading a big heist and has legs in his fantasy. It was this movie that gave Chaney the reputation of being able to transform himself for his roles and would begin his path to stardom at the time. And I dig this. It's a 3.5. The story beats are wild, and you have no idea where this is going. And Chaney is very entertaining, but it kind of goes nowhere for a little while before the bonkers ending. The significance is just a 1.5, though, since it's still fairly obscure and has some relevance for making Chaney a star. Should you watch it? Yeah, it is not a penalty to have to do so. Fast forward a bit to September 2nd, and we're back in Germany, since they seem to have the horror market covered, and it's Genuine, the Tragedy of the Vampire. It begins with a painter named Percy, who just finished a piece, and after he goes to bed, it comes to life. She leaves and heads out onto the street and ends up a part of a slave market where she's given the name Genuine and is said to be a tribal priestess. And an old man buys her and takes her back to his house? Whatever this room is, and locks her away. There's then a barber named Guillard, and for some reason he goes to the house every single day at noon, and no one knows why. Genuine begs to be free, but Melo refuses, and because everyone is curious as to what's going on in the house, they call Guillard in for questioning. To accommodate Melo, since he can't be there at noon, Guillard sends his nephew Florian in his place, while at the same time, Genuine gets out of her room and convinces the young man to slash his throat and beginning her revenge. And if this looks kind of familiar in terms of overall style, that's because it's also by Robert Wine, the director of Dr. Caligari. After the success of that film, he went back in with the same team to do a follow-up, using the same stylings and look, going even further with the imagery. Now, you may be saying to yourself, how is this the tragedy of the vampire when the first vampire film was said to be 1922's Nosferatu? Is this actually the first? And the answer is no, because there were several films from this era and before it that used the term vampire, but it was actually meant as a vamp, a succubus-like woman who seduces men and leads them to madness. Compared to Caligari, though, the movie was not a success at the box office and wasn't regarded in nearly the same way that that one was. The original runtime was around an hour and a half, but that version is unavailable to view. A shortened 43-minute version is the only way to see the film currently and the one that can be seen online. The full print of the film is available to view, but only at the Munich City Film Museum and their archive in Germany. And I liked this. I didn't like it as much as Caligari. I'm going to give it a 3. It had some cool things going, and visually, it is just an absolute treat. I started to lose focus of the story because I just really liked watching what was happening. And its significance is just a 1, because it is overshadowed by Caligari's success and isn't really spoken about too much at all. Should you watch it? I think it's worth a genuine watch. This next one did have premieres in the US in March and April, but the first full run was in Denmark, of all places, on September 28th, and it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We have our Jekyll right away, and it's John Barrymore, grandfather of Drew. And we saw him in the 30's project, and this was a full 10 years before that. Of course, the good doc has a clinic in which he tries to help the poor and is in love with Millicent, even though her father disapproves. He's a good doctor, and you could tell because he treats this little kid and manages to not accidentally cut his legs off, and while with some friends, he becomes obsessed with the concept introduced about man having two sides, a strong one and a weak one. It's compounded when he's tempted by a club dancer, so he dives into his research and comes up with the obligatory smoking formula and immediately drinks it. He transforms, although I'm not sure what this face is, but his physical form alters as well. He heads out into the night to cause some mischief. Now, of course, this is another variation on the classic tale, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson from 1886, and was not the first. This is actually the 11th version of the story since 1908, with 7 of those being from the US, although several of those are lost completely. This is perhaps one of the most famous versions of the tale and was by a guy named John S. Robertson, who was very active in the silent era but left the industry in the mid-30s due to a lack of interest in working with sound. Barrymore was already pretty established in the film world and had previously been a stage star, and when it came to the transformation stuff, they mainly left it up to the actor to convey the process through facial expressions as opposed to makeup. But they also added makeup further into the metamorphosis and then added some prosthetic fingertips to make his hands more claw-like. And you can see one of them go flying off when Hyde changes back to Jekyll. The film altered the original story by making Jekyll a younger and more handsome man, and also was the first time that Hyde reverted back to his normal state after dying at the end, as in the novel he remains in Hyde form after death. It also introduces the concept that Hyde becomes more monstrous with every evil act that he commits, and as the film goes on, his appearance becomes more distorted. And this is a solid take. I give this a 4. It's one of the more intriguing versions of the tale, and Barrymore's Hyde is pretty out there. Plus, I have a soft spot for Jekyll and Hyde movies. Its significance is a 4 as well, since it's the first big shot at this story and really made it a horror staple. Should you watch it? Absolutely. This next one doesn't have an official date, but did arrive in October at some point, and it's called The House of Whispers. It's a murder mystery with houses and secret passages and spooky voices, and was from Ernest Ward, a man who was pretty active in the film world, but passed away just a few years later in 1923 from a stomach ailment. This particular entry is also lost. The next entry is yet another from Germany, and this one debuted on October 29th there, right before Halloween. It reached the US in June of 1921, and it's The Golem, How He Came into the World. It begins with an omen from the stars saying that a disaster is about to befall the Jewish people of Prague. He tries to tell everyone, and sure enough, the next day there's a decree from the Roman emperor that all Jews must leave the city. Meanwhile, Rabbi Lowe, who was the man who made the prediction from the stars, prepares to invoke the power of the golem to save his people. The emperor sends one of his men, Florian, to deliver the message, and he meets with Lowe, and also falls for his daughter Miriam. That night, Lowe finishes his clay golem and enlists his assistant to animate it. Meanwhile, Florian and Miriam get it on, which I guess consists of placing their hands on each other's chests. And hey, speaking of chests, the way to bring the golem to life is to take this special amulet and place the word life on it, and they do a whole thing with a circle of fire and a star symbol in order to find the word. With it, they wake up the golem, and he's got that classic page boy haircut, and I'm pretty sure I had this same hairdo when I was 8, and at first, they just have him doing odd jobs and such, but when they take it to the emperor, it saves everyone from a collapsing ceiling and earns a pardon for their people. But when things start to go wrong and the big guy starts to turn, can they stop their own creation? This was by Paul Wegener and Carl Bose and was based on a novel from 1915 and was actually a sequel. There were 2 earlier films with the Golem, and this one was a prequel, which is why the subtitle is How He Came into the World. The first film was from 1915 and was just called The Golem, and the second was from 1917 and called The Golem and the Dancing Girl, and both of those films are lost, and this is the only remaining entry. And not only was this a hit in the native Germany, but also in the US, where it played to packed houses for the entirety of the summer of 1921. It was also highly acclaimed, with many appraising the sets and acting. Over time, it's become one of the more well-known films of the silent era and has shown up on a number of the most important films of all time lists. And this is lovely. It's a 4. The visuals are just entrancing, and the look of the golem is kind of low-tech but really effective. Its significance is a 3, since it's highly influential but also hasn't been much seen, and although it was very well known at one point, the tale of the golem hasn't kept up. Should you watch it? That's a yes. Our final film of 1920 is one that got its first actual release in Sweden, although it's another German film, and did premiere there back in April, and it's The Head of Ynos, or Der Ynoskopf. This was another by F.W. Murnau and was another take on Jekyll and Hyde, but this is another one that is lost and is one of the most sought-after lost films. It was highly acclaimed when it came out and featured Conrad Veidt and Bela Lugosi. 1921 starts on January 1st, which is pretty appropriate, and we head over to Sweden for The Phantom Carriage, which opens with Edith here on her deathbed, and she asks for them to send for a man named David Holm, so her friend rushes out to find him. It's also New Year's Eve, and David is this drunk dude just hanging out in graveyards and telling spooky stories to his booze friends, and he talks about his good pal George. And on a previous New Year's Eve, he told them if you die on that night, you're stuck driving death's carriage for the new year. He describes the carriage, and I should point out that he's having a flashback in the middle of a flashback, and it's said that for death, one night is 100 years, collecting all of the souls of those that died. We see Death going around and doing his work, and I am not lying. He puts his entire arm up this guy's butt and then tosses his spirit in his wagon and moves on. Guy drowns, he gets him too, and I imagine all this would be easier if Death looked like a cute girl with an ankh necklace, but George says that the last soul to die each year is destined to drive that wagon and do all that work. Turns out that last year, George died on the eve, and right before midnight, the fellas start a brawling, and a head injury kills Dave. Sure enough, his buddy's death, and he says that it's all his fault that he's a bum since he used to be happily married with kids. But then the boozing began. He went to jail, and his wife Anna left him. He searched all over for her, but ended up meeting Edith, and is a dick to her, but she still asks him to return on the next New Year's Eve. But now he has to take over the job as Death, and Edith is on his list, so I guess he'll be keeping that promise. And this is directed and co-written by Victor Sjostrom, and he also plays David, and he'd been directing since 1912, and this one was released on January 1st in order to tie in with that whole New Year's Eve theme that's going on here. And when it was released in the US a year later, they gave it the title The Stroke of Midnight, while the Brits called it Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness, with an exclamation point. It was pretty revolutionary at the time because of the ghostly special effects, all done through double exposures, and keep in mind, during this time frame, they had to be done in camera. That means that they couldn't just do some sort of post-production edit. They had to shoot the film, reload it, and shoot over top of it with the secondary image. It ended up being a very influential in the Swedish market, and Ingmar Bergman was said to be a fan, and you can see it leaking into The Seventh Seal. It was very critically acclaimed and was quite successful, and even Charlie Chaplin was a fan, calling it the best movie ever made. And whoa, this appeals directly to me. I give this a 4, and yeah, I'm partial to movies about death doing his job, but the sheer technical stuff on display here is jaw-dropping, and it's a great story too. Its HCS is a 2 since it's very important to Swedish cinema, not so much American cinema. And I have a feeling that this is a very little seen film, although it should be seen more. Should you watch it? Yeah, and don't wait until New Year's Eve to do it. This next one came out in February in Australia, although the day is unknown, and it's Dracula's Death. And it's pretty important because it appears to be the first appearance of Count Dracula on film, although it doesn't adapt the novel and is instead a new story and may or may not depict the character as a vampire. It's considered lost, although it was thought that a print may exist in the Hungarian archive, but it appears that there may have been confusion as to a novelization of the film being there instead. There was another one in February that was released in Germany, although it's marked as a 1920 film since a certificate was issued for it then, but it's called Desire. It was another one from Germany, and another one from F.W. Murnau, and another one that's thought to be lost. This was apparently about a murder plot involving a dancer and a grand duchess, and again starred Conrad Veidt. Okay, so this next one may be short, but so is the film. But on February 21st, there was the debut of The Haunted House. It has old Stoneface himself, Buster Keaton, as a bank teller headed into work, and some criminal who has rigged up an old, supposedly haunted house to help them with a heist. Meanwhile, it looks like this clerk is working the bank alone, and it turns out that the criminal guy is the bank's manager, and shenanigans ensue that include glue getting all over the money. The gang attempted to rob the bank, but then get blamed for it, while nearby a theater troupe doing Faust end up on the run and hide in that old house. So soon, there's the fake gangster ghosts, poor old Buster just trying to hide from the people who think he robbed the bank, and the theater guys who everyone now thinks are actual devils and demons. And I included this because Buster Keaton is a freaking genius, and the man basically ruined himself for the art of film, and this was still in his earlier days of his film work, before he would really ramp things up and end up hanging off of freaking clock towers. And not much of his work falls into horror, or even horror comedy such as this, so it's fun to see him up against ghosts, even if they're fake ones. And Buster gets a 3.5 from me. This man went above and beyond every time with pushing his limits and doing interesting things with film, and is always a treat. Its HCS is low though at a 1.5 since it's not one that's widely seen, even for a Keaton film, but it's still a Buster Keaton work, so it does have merit. Should you watch it? Yep. Let's head back over to Austria for this next one, and this debuted there on March 18th. and was called the Grinning Face, but also the Man Who Laughs. It's set in 1690 in France, and it starts in a pretty awful way. It talks about these guys, and their whole thing is buying up babies from needy families, mutilating them, and putting them on display as curiosities. Then this lord puts his child in the care of a woman, but she's jealous that the kid will inherit the family fortune and arranges for those dudes to get him, and they sneak in and take him away. They say they plan to give him an eternal smile, and the king is committed to finding little Fermain. 8 years pass, and they finally track them down, and they flee, leaving the kid behind. His face had been carved into a permanent smile, and he actually ends up taking a dying woman's baby, and another 6 years pass. And then this happens, and I don't know what's going on here, because this thing appears to be a chimp in a towel. Like, you were invited to the fancy ball when people are bringing their monkeys with them. Fermain is now older and has a blind girlfriend, although, I mean, this is what he looks like, and I'm not really sure what the whole disfiguring thing is. He literally just looks like a guy making a silly face. Turns out that the blind girl is that little baby, and that's a little weird, right? And yeah, he's been making a living by doing shows under the name Gwynplaine, and everyone comes from miles around to see a guy with a slightly larger smile. But then a wealthy woman takes a liking to him and will stop at nothing to make him her possession. And this is a weird one from Julius Herska, who only made a tiny handful of films, and this was his first. It's based on a book, The Man Who Laughs, from Victor Hugo from 1869, and that was adapted many times, and this was the second go at it, but there would be a number of other versions, including one from 1928 that would go on to become the inspiration for the Joker. And this one barely treads on the surface of horror, and I think is mainly dropped into the category based on the whole kid mutilation bit, which isn't really that much of the story, but let's face it, it doesn't really look all that much like they did anything to him. And this one's a 2. It's just dull and staged very oddly, and that smile doesn't come off the way that they think that it does. It absolutely never looks convincing. Its significance is just a 1, and the remake would likely score higher here, but it's even less horror-related than this one. Should you watch it? Keep a grin on your face by skipping it. One month later, pretty nearby in Germany, there was an April 7th release under the title of The Haunted Castle. This has a group of guys meeting for a good old-fashioned hunting trip, and Count Ouch, I don't know, Oetsch, whatever that says, arrives, and he's this odd-faced gentleman. He wasn't invited to their party because it said that he shot and killed his brother a while back, and seriously, look at the smug look on this sucker's face. I wouldn't ask him to my party just for that. That bro's widow is there, and she's been remarried, and she's not too happy to see the Count, like, at all. She wants to leave, but everyone is excited about the arrival of Father Pharamond, so she decides to stick around. Everyone prepares to go out on a hunt, but whatever, decides to stay back, except when the father is meant to arrive, and that's when he heads out. And Pharamond arrives, and he's got one hell of a stylish hairdo. Like, look at this. Is this a bald cap and wig, or did he shave his head to be like this? We find out that the Baroness's marriage was anything but perfect, and he went on a trip, and then became obsessed with the occult, and this guy had some severe Malkovich energy going on right here. She says that she feels guilty because she wished for something evil to happen to him, and the Count seems to say that she's responsible for his death. But is she? Is he? Who's the real culprit here? And what secret is the good father hiding? Maybe something under that bald head. And this is not so much a horror movie and more of a crime drama. In fact, I originally didn't have it on my roster because it didn't really fit, but I figured I should toss it in here because it's the first time that we're getting an entry by the great F.W. Murnau, director of Nosferatu. He made several films before this, and I've even mentioned one a little earlier in his video, but this is the first horror one that has survived. Murnau would only be active in this decade, and only had one film released in the 30s as he was killed in a car accident in 1931. This one was adapted from a novel by Rudolf Stratz that was told in serial form. The film version was shot hastily in 16 days and made it to the screen before the final chapter of the story could even be published. For a while, the only way to view it was in a chopped-down 56-minute version that cut out some scenes and made the plot incoherent, but it was eventually restored to its full 74-minute version. And I was hoping for some cool imagery and German expressionism based on that poster art, but I didn't get it. And so this is a 2.5 from me. It's a little dry and dull, even if it does have a few moments that hint at what the director would be capable of later. Its significance is a 2 since it's by Murnau, but is not one of his more known entries, and doesn't impact the genre too much since it's barely horror. Should you watch it, you could likely skip visiting this castle. It turns out it's not really that haunted. On July 4th, in Italy, there was another one with a famous monster, and it's Il Mostro di Frankenstein. And this was an earlier, although not the earliest take on the Frankenstein story. It was by Eugenio Testa and is also considered lost. In fact, there's very little evidence of it left. All that remains is a single photo, some random promotional stuff, and one printed review that describes the film. The final film of the year is from what was then Czechoslovakia and debuted there on October 14th, and it's The Arrival from the Darkness. And the only version of this that I could track down to watch had no subtitles, so I'm going to do my best to figure out what's happening here using a translator app. So, Richard brings his friend a book and is in love with his wife Dagmar and tries to convince her to leave him, but she's torn. Meanwhile, Drzicki becomes so obsessed with the book that he just forgets he's married apparently, but then is like, oh, hey, where did everyone go? Richard leaves, ashamed, and the book tells of the Black Tower, and it's a mystery, and as he's trying to unravel it, he falls asleep. Later, he goes to the tower himself to investigate, and finds a secret passageway, but it was all a setup from Richard, who locks him in. People try to console Dagmar over her missing husband while he finds a man with a parchment on him that gives instructions on how to bring him back to life, and it turns out that he's his ancestor and is able to revive him after a series of flashbacks detailing how he ended up with this secret elixir of life. But Daninsky still needs to escape and return to his wife before that dastardly Richard can move in on her. And there's not a ton of information out there about this one. It was by Jan S. Kolar and seems to have had more success as an actor than a director. It looks like it was also shot at an actual castle and was released under the name Redivivis. And it's an interesting, if not really all that engaging film, so I give it a 2.5. I like the gothic look to it all, and there's a nice atmosphere to all that tower stuff, but the story's a little stiff. Its HCS is just a 1, since it's extremely obscure, and no one really went on to any other horror projects. Should you watch it, this is one you could probably leave in the darkness. This year actually starts off on a down note with one that arrived on January 29th with One Glorious Day, which had Will Rogers and Alan Hale Sr. in it. It was a comedy horror film about a ghost named E.K. that would take over a man's body and go have fun while the man would try to get it back. It was a bit notorious since it was originally meant for Fatty Arbuckle to star in it, but shortly before filming he had his infamous scandal and had to drop out. It is, however, a lost film, and no copies are known to exist. This next one arrived in Germany on March 15th and truly made history because that's the day that the world first met Nosferatu. We're told about a town called Weisborg and a man named Hutter who had a wife, and look at that, 100 years ago and movies knew that success meant putting a cat in your movie. He works for a guy named Knock with a dazzling hairdo and eyebrow combo and gets a summons from a man named Count Orlok who wants to buy some local property, although his letter is written in what appears to be the the doodles I would make in the margins of my school notebooks. It's said to be a somewhat perilous trip, so Ellen is worried, and he heads off into the Carpathian Mountains. The locals there seem deeply afraid of Orlok, including this guy, and you'd think a dude with a mustache like this wouldn't be afraid of anything. After some difficulty getting there, he finally reaches the castle and is met by Orlok, who is this odd-looking man with weird eyebrows. And yeah, really, in a world where Nock is a regular guy, why is Orlok that much creepier? The Count shows an unusual attraction to blood and an aversion to sunlight, and Hodor wakes up the next day with what he thinks are mosquito bites on his neck. He's oblivious at first, but soon starts to figure out that his host is indeed a vampire. His wife has premonitions about it, all the while the evil Count skulks around menacingly. Hodor escapes, and shortly after, Orlok makes his way to Weisborg, bringing the rats and plague along with him, intent on claiming Ellen for his own. And if all of that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because it sounds exactly like Dracula. This was actually an unauthorized adaptation of the Bram Stoker Dracula novel, and quite a few details were carried over wholesale. The similarities were so great that Stoker's estate sued them, and I'll get back to that in a moment. At this point in cinema, there were no vampire films, only films with female vampires or vamps, who were just human women luring men into temptation. This was officially the first film to feature a supernatural creature vampire. It was directed by F.W. Murnau, who did last year's The Haunted Castle, and he wanted Conrad Veidt, the man who played Cesare in the Cabinet of Dr. Kagari, to play the Count, but he was unavailable, so they cast then unknown Max Schreck. It was done on a fairly low budget, which made some of the shoot difficult, particularly since they only had one camera available. It was actually quite a big hit and made Murnau into a major player, and it was also rather acclaimed, pushing the vampire into the spotlight. And oh yeah, about that, this movie is where the idea of vampires dying in the sunlight comes from, as lore before this showed them merely uncomfortable in the sun, although it wasn't fatal. But then there was that lawsuit. The Stokers won the suit, and a court declared the film to be plagiarism and ordered all copies to be destroyed. Luckily, though, a number of prints survived and over time have been restored, and it's now seen as the classic that it is. There's also been a number of remakes, including a rather big one from 1979, Klaus Kinski, and of course a brand new version by Robert Eggers with Bill Skarsgård as the Count. And I'll give this a 4. It's a pretty powerful film, and I can certainly acknowledge its achievements and impacts, although it's not one that I love watching. I do like to watch it, but it's not one I would just throw on for the hell of it. Its significance is a 4.5 since it's the first vampire film and helped define the lore, but I can't give it the full 5 because it's not been something that the mass public has seen and will always be in Drax's shadow. Should you watch it? Yes, indeed. The Count commands it. Our next entry fast forwards all the way to September 10th, and it's a horror comedy called The Ghost Breaker. It was a story about a man helping out a young woman to rid her father's mansions of ghosts, which may or may not be fake, and it had Wallace Reed in the lead, and this was later remade into The Ghost Breakers in 1940 with Bob Hope. This version, however, is now lost. We now go to a film that first debuted in Sweden on September 18th for a really bizarre one, and a film that wouldn't make it into the US until 1929, and it's Haxen. It begins with a dissertation of sorts about early cultures and the prominence of occult imagery, showing us how early time saw the model of the universe. It shows the outer reaches, and then also a deeper core, which is meant to be hell, and gives instructions on how to ward off witches. Everything is shown to us through a series of illustrations and carvings, and we find out about superstitions around witchcraft. It then becomes a narrative film, and we have a couple of witches in a cabin pulling out rotted hands and brewing potions. A woman comes by looking to buy a love potion from Karna, and she uses it to win over this monk. And I mean, look at this guy. Who wouldn't want to fall in love with them, right? This lady's like, I want this burping, spitting man who looks suspiciously like Kyle Gass. But the devil shows up, and look at this thing. This is pretty awesome for 1922, and it tempts a young woman, and then another witch who dreams of a castle and riches. This portion has some stop motion animation even. Like, look at this little fella. But then there's demon costumes and fantastic sets. There's then another segment about a guy who has died and his family blames a local woman and says she's a witch who cursed him, and then continues in that manner with the film giving demonstrations on how witchcraft was then dealt with. And this is such an odd film. It's unlike anything else from this whole period. It was both written and directed by Benjamin Christensen, a Danish man who had made 2 previous films and would continue on until 1942. And we'll discuss him again in a little bit later in the 20s as well. It was the most expensive Scandinavian film made up until this point, with a cost of 2 million kroner, and it was inspired by Christensen's own fascination with the history of witch hunting. He had found this book called the Malleus Maleficarum and spent the next couple of years studying it and similar manuals about witches. And his intention was to make something original as opposed to simply adapting a book or play, which was the standard at that time. At the time, it received a fair amount of backlash, as several countries were offended by the inclusion of scenes of torture, nudity, and what they called sexual perversion. And also since it had a somewhat unfavorable view of the religious and portrayed them as blindly lashing out against things that they didn't understand and calling them evil and destroying them because some things never change, right? It would go on to a cult success and would end up being re-released in '68 in an altered form, now called Witchcraft Through the Ages, and featured a narration by none other than William S. Burroughs, who likely made this whole thing less surreal, I'm sure. And, my guys, this is a 4. This is so well crafted, and the effects are stunning for the time. And surprise, surprise, that it's actually a reasoned response to the fear-mongering about witchcraft and the occult. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's grown a pretty sizable following over the years, and is one of the more discussed films of the time period, but it's never been widely seen, and is a cult film at best. Should you watch it? Absolutely, get witchy with it. Let's go back to America now for an entry that arrived on November 5th, as we reach the end of the year with The Headless Horseman. It's set in 1790 in the town of Sleepy Hollow, and we meet Katrina, the most sought-after woman in town. She's enamored with a big hunk of a man named Van Brunt, but one day the new school teacher comes into town, and he's Ichabod Crane, of course. He's played by legendary actor and Connecticut Yankee Will Rogers, and his appearance immediately rankles some people, but there's also the local legends. There's story of a mysterious headless horseman, who's said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper that lost his head in the battle and spends the nights searching for it. Icky goes to work, and oh man, the kid in the dunce cap. I know that this was a real thing, but I had to look it up, and it was mostly implemented in the 19th and early 20th centuries and was considered a mean-spirited punishment even during its time. Mr. Crane is fascinated by ghost stories and witchcraft and tells tales to everyone, which is seen as unprofessional by other townspeople, and he soon ends up in a love triangle with himself, Katrina, and Van Brunt. Much of the film deals with that, and Van Brunt trying to make it look like Crane is involved with a group of witches and is in league with the devil, and Ichabod's efforts to prove his innocent, which pretty much the entire first hour of this movie is devoted to this subplot. And oh my god, does Ichabod live in the Amityville house? What the hell? And yeah, this movie is only an hour and a couple of minutes long, and there's no Headless Horseman action until the final couple of minutes. And this was a directorial debut for Edward Venturini, and he had a pretty short career and only directed a handful of pictures, with the final one being in 1939. It was an unusual role for Rogers, who was mainly cast in a heroic role, so playing a nerdy type who is pretty harsh on children was against the type. It was the first black and white film to use panchromatic stock, a more expensive film that was a higher quality and gave more accurate tones than the standard orthochromatic stock. Although several adaptations of the tale had been done during the silent period, this is the only one that survives and can still be seen. And this is a slog. It's a 1.5 from me. It's dull and flat and spends way too much time with the fake witchcraft plot and not enough of what we want to see. A Headless Horseman in a movie called The Headless Horseman. Its significance is the same since it's not a much discussed version of the tale, and were it not for Rogers' involvement, didn't have any notable names. Should you watch it, you can likely leave this one. The next one debuted on December 3rd and had a bigger rollout a week later on the 10th, and it was called A Blind Bargain. This was by Wallace Worsley, a man we'll discuss a little later on in the episode, and featured Lon Chaney as a mad doctor who creates an ape man with the actor playing both roles. It had a hard time with censors since they claimed that it was about a man attempting to play God and creating artificial life, and was cut down drastically and was quite successful, but the last surviving print is thought to have been destroyed in a fire in 1931 and is now completely lost. This next one came out a touch earlier in the year in Istanbul, not Constantinople, but it had its premiere on December 31st of 1922, but it went wider in February of 23. And Salame. Sorry, I'm just really hungry. This begins with a quick rundown of the biblical story of King Herod and John the Baptist. It's in the king's court, and beautiful Salome is here and given a bit too much attention from her stepdad, which pisses off his wife, but maybe he was just fascinated by her hair lights. Or these guys' hair balls. Everyone's got really cool hair things going on here. And hats. Look at these wonderful hats. Like, I have no idea what's going on here, but I'm somewhat angry that I can't have this hairstyle. She asks to see a prisoner named Jokanan, and she's pretty infatuated with him, much to the chagrin of the Tetrarch. There's some dancing and moping and more dancing as Jokanan spurs Salome's affections, and the price of a kiss is a dance before the king, with grisly results. And yes, this is a version of the Bible story, but it's more of an adaptation of the Oscar Wilde play from 1891 that was also called Salome. It was there that the character's name was changed to Jokanan, as opposed to John, and was adapted by Charles Bryant and Alla Nazimova, who also plays Salome. Because of its general lack of a storyline and greater emphasis on visual stylings, it's often referred to as one of the very first art films, created more for an aesthetic than to tell a specific plot. Weirdly, even though most of the film takes place on a single stage, it was very expensive to make, running a tab of more than $350,000. Because everything had to be built and built indoors, and all of the crazy costumes had to be handmade, it tallied up costs rather quickly. It was super controversial at the time, and its artsy backdrops caused every major studio to back away from it, so it became an entirely independent production and took a long time to find anyone to distribute it. When it did, it was a failure, and Nazimova, who was also the producer on it, dropped out of the producing game and stuck strictly to acting afterwards. It's said to be an early standout for gay and lesbian filmmaking, as a large chunk of the cast was rumored to be either gay or bisexual, and prominently featured characters in drag. And it originally went even further, featuring a depiction of a relationship between two male soldiers, although those scenes ended up being cut out. And it's hard to judge this one, so I'll go with a 3.5. It's super pretty and just fascinating to look at, and there's always something cool going on. But it's also not exactly a film you can get wrapped up in the plot for, since it isn't one. Its significance is a 2.5, since it is slightly more known and a famous tale, but perhaps not the most known take on it, but it did have a solid impact on the art world over time. Should you watch it? Yes, get wrapped up in her dance. We're headed into 1932 now, and the first one came out on May 8th, and it was called While Paris Sleeps. This had Victor McLaglen as a man sentenced to life in prison for murder who escapes to Paris and finds his daughter. There, he has to try to keep her safe from those trying to take advantage of her while also remaining unfound. It was from Maurice Tournier, who had been directing since 1912, with most of his works in France, and this was made in 1920 under the title The Glory of Love, but not released until 23, where it was given the new name While Paris Sleeps. And this is another that is lost, with only posters and stills existing. This next one is from halfway through the year, on June 7th, and is The Last Moment. This had Henry Hull from Werewolf of London, and features a ship with a big nasty captain, and his big ape-like monster that he uses on his enemies. It was the final film for J. Parker Reed Jr., who only directed 5 films, with this being the last one, but this is also lost. And that takes us to September 6th for a film that's not lost, and maybe the most known for the era, and it's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's at the famous cathedral in 1482, and we meet Quasimodo right off the bat with that iconic makeup, and he's played by none other than Lon Chaney in the role that he's likely most known for. There's a guy named Clopin who is dubbed the King of the Beggars, and a guy named Jehan, the brother of the church's archdeacon, who is a good guy named Dom Claude. Quasi freaks everyone out, and he works for Jehan, and Clopin has a woman that he has raised as his daughter named Esmeralda, but her and her father are scorned by the townspeople. One night she goes to dance, and Jehan becomes enamored with her, so he sends Mr. Moto after her to kidnap. Thankfully, the soldier Phoebus is there to rescue her, and Quasi is captured, abandoned by his dick boss. When he's ordered to be punished for the crime, he's taken to the town square and meant to be lashed, and his misshapen body is revealed. However, Esmeralda takes pity on him and brings him water in an act of kindness, and also falls in love with Phoebus. But then things get problematic when Clopin disapproves of her new love, as does Jehan, and it kicks off some murder and uprisings. And remember a few minutes ago when I said that we talk about Wallace Worsley again? Well, he directed this one too, and it was by Universal. It could maybe be considered the first Universal monster pick, although it's a stretch to call Quasi a monster. The character was a dream role for Chaney. He had been trying to get a version of the film made himself, and there were even a couple of false starts with other directors and companies before this. When Universal finally agreed to make it, Chaney suggested Worsley, since they had just worked together on A Blind Bargain, and on a few films before that. It was very expensive for the time, and it's estimated to have cost between $750K to $1 million, and was officially the priciest Chaney film ever made. It paid off since it was a massive hit, grossing $3.5 million and becoming Universal's most successful silent film. Unfortunately, the original negatives and the old prints no longer exist, and the only versions still out there are 16mm prints for home viewing, and are of a lower quality. Attempts have been made to restore the film and improve the film quality, and those have been released on Blu-ray in recent years. And I'll go for a 3.5 on this one. It's a great version of the tale. It could stand to be a bit more stylish though, and the story does drag a touch, but it's some really good stuff. Its HCS is a 4.5 though, since it's one of the more known films of this era, and kicked off Universal's interest in horror films, setting the stage for an onslaught to come in the next decade and more. Should you watch it? Yep, this ain't no Disney version. Now we're headed back over to Germany, a place that we've been a lot in the 20s, for a film that premiered there on October 16th and eventually ran in the US, but not until 1927, and it's Warning Shadows. I guess the German title for this was closer to Shadows, a Nocturnal Hallucination, and we're introduced to the characters in this little shadow play, and very coolly told, it's Act 1, by way of a finger. You have this wealthy count, and he's rather jealous of how much attention that his wife gets, and her guy friends seem to like to egg him on through the use of shadows, and she seems to enjoy making him a bit crazy. And one thing to point out here is that unlike a lot of the other silents, there doesn't appear to be any intertitles, so all of the events are determined simply by actions alone. This was apparently done in an effort to create a pure film and utilize the abilities of cinema that weren't available to other forms of art, such as moving images. As the night goes on, they continue with the puppet shows using shadows, and where's a killer clown when you need one, right? But then an oddball of a man shows up and sets up our second act, and he's referred to as the Shadow Player. He has this massive candelabra that he carries around with him everywhere, and he puts on a show while also seemingly stoking the flames of the Count's green-eyed monster. He then uses some sort of magic, and everyone is transported to a hallucinatory realm where they get these prolonged visions about what the Count will do if they keep making moves on his wife. And this was by a man named Arthur Robeson. And due to the use of shadows in such a large number of scenes throughout, it's often labeled as a great example of German Expressionism. And even though it's not as well known as some of the others, it's often referred to as being as important as them. There were a number of people here that were also involved with Nosferatu, including Alexander Grenache, who plays the Shadow Player, and he was Knock in that other film. Unfortunately, this one didn't quite leave a mark and fell by the wayside in terms of public attention and has slipped into relative obscurity, although it's still held up by some as being a visual pioneer's film. And I'm giving it a 3.5. It's doing so many cool visual tricks with lights and shadows that it's just a delight to watch, although the plot is pretty unengaging and it's definitely a touch long for the subject matter. But visually, it's outstanding. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's fairly lost to time, but it does get discussed when German Expressionism is brought up. Should you watch it? It depends. If you're interested in seeing them do cool shot after cool shot with shadows, then yes. If you're looking for a solid story, probably not. The final entry of 1923 came out on December 16th, although Wikipedia says February of 1924, and AFI backs that up and says that there were some delays with it, so it's unclear when the actual release was, but it's The Wolfman. Now, this isn't some werewolf film that you were unaware of, as it was just about a man who turns into a wolf when he drinks a lot, and wolf is used in the connotations of being a predatory jerk. It was by Edmund Mortimer and starred John Gilbert and Norma Shearer, but this one is currently lost completely. We're now into 1924, and on January 27th, there was one called The Shadow of the East, which was also called The Shadow of the Desert. It was based on a novel with the same name and involved a death curse from India. It was by a French director named Georges Archambaud and was weird because its ad said that it was a sequel to a 1921 movie called The Sheikh, although it was simply based on a book by the same author, and The Sheikh had its own sequels later on. This is another one that is also lost, though, and is unable to view. Believe it or not, but our next one jumps all the way to September 7th, and we're back in the United States with Dante's Inferno. We're introduced to sleazy businessman Mortimer Judd, and really, why did I say sleazy there? Isn't that just sort of assumed? He has a son named Ernest, and I guess they have some sort of record player that shows video images, and a pretty sick 1924 burn. Mortimer is also a slumlord and all-around bad guy, and his wife is very sick. And one day he receives a copy of Dante's Inferno in the mail. As he reads it, he sees visions formed from the book, including that classic abandon all hope thing, and we get views of what's going on down there, and the standard horned demons and hellfire, and as he's reading, he's watched over by a demon. Meanwhile, his kids seem to be kinder-hearted than he is, try to get him to soften up, but he's nasty to his tenants, which drives one of them to commit suicide. He even kicks his own son out of the house because he finds him trysting with a maid, and that neighbor's death places a curse on him, which results in him facing a trial in hell. So, this was by Henry Otto, a man who had been directing since 1912, mostly shorts, and this was actually one of his very last works. It was an adaptation of Inferno, just one section of the poem Divine Comedy. It embellishes that, though, with an almost Scrooge element as Judd is forced by these spirits to confront his own greed. There was an earlier version of this back in 1911 called L'Inferno from Italy, and it would get another shot in 1935 as Dante's Inferno again. This version features some odd quirks in it. There's a character in blackface, and he was a rather famed and noted comic actor, so he was instantly recognized, which seems to have caused some laughs in early screenings. It was also noted for featuring more nudity than usual, as a number of the denizens of hell are completely naked. It said that when it was released in New York, it had a record-breaking total of $3,000 in one day, and that audiences were bigger than usual, although no real numbers exist to get a final number. And this is fine. It's a 2.5 from me, and that might have been higher if there existed a better print, because it's hard to see what was going on in hell at times. But it's okay. It just gets a touch monotonous after a while. Its HCS is a 2, since it's the first American shake at this tale, but not really the most known and didn't really have much in the way of names. Should you watch it? It's fairly skippable, but a decent watch. Just a bit later, on September 18th, there was a release called A Son of Satan that was written, directed, produced, and distributed by one man, Oscar Micheaux, a black man hailed as the first major African American filmmaker. This film involved a man taking a bet to spend a single night in a legendary haunted house, but is sadly also now lost. Very shortly after, in Germany, on September 24th, there was an entry that wouldn't get a US release until June of 1928, and it's The Hands of Orlak. This has Orlak, a constant pianist, and he's played by Conrad Veidt, who we've already seen in The Cabinet of Dr Kagari, and his wife is awaiting his return. However, his train crashes, and after a desperate search, they find him in the wreckage, still alive. Meanwhile, a criminal named Vasseur is scheduled to be executed, and when they get Paul to the hospital, it's revealed that his hands cannot be saved. Since they're his entire life and career, his wife begs the doctor to do something, and when she sees them bringing in Vasseur's body, he decides to take drastic measures and transplants his hands. Right away, though, troubles arise as Orlak sees a mysterious man laughing at him that disappears and visions of murder. They start to dominate his life, so he pleads with the doctor to take them back off, but he refuses, as the urge to kill is not in the hands, but the mind. The plot thickens, though, when a man claiming to be Vasseur, with his head transplanted onto another body, shows up. And this one is, again, by Robert Wiene, who we've been discussing quite a lot. He did The Cabinet of Dr Kagari, as well as Genuine, The Tragedy of a Vampire, and he was very much a part of the whole German Expressionist movement. Although this film doesn't truly fall into that category, and in fact, there's some argument as to whether it can be considered an example of it. It was based on a book called Les Mains de Orlak, a book from 1920, and if the story sounds familiar, it's because it was later adapted into Mad Love, a film I covered on the 30's project. It did quite well when it was released, and the reviews were strong, praising the visual stylings. It was commented that the plotline is fairly standard and not extremely original, but that Wiene's artistic flourishes set it apart from all of the others of the era. There was a bit of an issue with censors, though, since they thought that some of the demonstrations of criminal behaviors and ways to evade police might be used in real life. And the film would give people, heaven forbid, ideas. However, it was eventually deemed too unrealistic to be taken seriously and passed the board. And I thought this one was fairly entertaining, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3. It doesn't really do anything too profound, and it's really not that great of a story, but it is a fun one and worth watching. Its horror cultural significance is a 2, though, since it's a slightly more well-known title and had Wiene at the helm and had Veidt in the lead. Should you watch it? I'd say yes, I'd say give this one a hand. Our final film of 1924 came out in Germany on November 13th and didn't get a release in the US until 5 years later in 1929, and it's Waxworks with an S, and Zach Galligan ain't in this. It's set in a circus, and there's a wax museum there, and the proprietor hires a young writer to create a story about some of his figures. He agrees and gets to work, and since the wax figure of Harun al-Rashid had lost an arm, he decides to tell a story about how he got that way. And, lady, maybe some space? Like, geez, ma'am, maybe like 2 feet back? He then begins his story and imagines himself as a baker who's married, and al-Rashid is here, and he was an actual notorious caliph of Baghdad. When smoke from the baker's ovens causes al-Rashid to lose a game of chess, he's angered and wants to claim his head, but instead falls for his wife. He sneaks out to see her and oversees Assad plotting to steal his wishing ring. And like, the guy has a wishing ring. Why didn't he just wish to win that game of chess? Better yet, just wish for the wife to come up and fall in love with him. It sounds like a sucky wishing ring to me. But will Assad get the ring? Will his wife ditch him for riches and powers? And how about that dude's arm? This second story is about Ivan the Terrible, played by Conrad Veidt, who is just all over the 20's project and looks different every time. Here, Ivan really loves to poison people, so much so that he has this guy called the Poison Mixer, who has an hourglass that keeps track of how much time it would take for a victim to be overcome by their poison. But the mixer double crosses him and instead writes Ivan's name. The final story is about Jack the Ripper, although the available print calls him Springheel Jack, and I'll talk about that in a second. But here, the Ripper instead comes to life to threaten our young poet. And this one is by Paul Lenny and Leo Berinsky, and teetered on the horror genre, since parts of it are clearly comedy. Originally, it was screened in a different order, showing the Ivan the Terrible segment first, and then the Jack the Ripper bit, with the Caliph story ending the show. Later, however, it was restored back to this order, which is how it was originally intended and scripted. Most of the versions of the film didn't survive, though, and the original German edition is now lost. This surviving copy is from a British print, which substituted Springheel Jack for Jack the Ripper in order to get around British censors who wouldn't allow the portrayal of a real-life murderer. It has since been restored and given a new score, but there was also an infamous live performance in 2013 in which Mike Patton of Faith No More and Mr. Bungle performed with a trio of percussionists to do a live score for it, which can be seen on YouTube. And this is a 3. There's some fun moments here, but it's a little lightweight, although it's a pretty early take on the horror anthology. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not well known and didn't make a big impact, but it does have some notoriety going for it. Should you watch it? Yes. Would you like to take a closer look?
We're going to start really quick by going back to 1921 for a film that I said was lost, but it turns out that I was wrong, and it's available now and came out on October 6th of 1921 in Germany, and it's Der Müde Tod, otherwise known as Destiny. It has a couple in a carriage that also has a woman just traveling with a duck that they wrap a blanket around, and I'm like, if I'm traveling and someone has a duck, I'm gonna want to see that thing the whole time. Along the way, they stop for a dark-clad stranger and give him a ride. They go into town, and he soon becomes the big gossip topic, and he buys a big garden next to a cemetery and builds this massive wall around it with no doors to get in. One day, the stranger shows up at a bar where that young couple are, and when the woman goes home real quick, she returns to find her lover gone, and they say that he left with the stranger. She goes looking for him, winding up at that wall, only to see a group of spirits go straight through it and her. Unfortunately, her lover is among them, and as she tries to beg him not to leave, he goes through. She's despondent, so she manages to cross over and confront the stranger, who is actually Death, and tries to plead for the life of her love. She claims that love is stronger than death, so he offers her a challenge and shows her 3 candles that are flickering, which means that they're close to death. He then says that if she's able to save any of the lives with love, that he'll return her fella. It then tells 3 stories, the first being set at Ramadan and telling of a man accused of being an infidel who narrowly escapes with his life, but that guy's in love with the caliph's sister and tries to return to her in secret while being hunted down. The second story takes place in Venice during a carnival season, and the noblewoman has a lover, but also a fiancé who's a member of the upper crust, and she's obligated to marry him even though she hates him. Girolamo knows about Gianfresco, though, and plans to have him killed, and although she plans to save him, Girolamo has other ideas. The third story is set in China and has a magician get a letter from the emperor who wants to have him perform at his party, but if he doesn't impress him, he'll get beheaded. Trouble arises when the Emp wants Ahi's assistant for himself, though her lover disapproves and is taken away for it, and it's now up to Tiao to escape and rescue her guy. And this one is from visionary director Fritz Lang, the man who will later see do Metropolis and M. And this was the big film for him that he was known for before those others gained more notoriety. When released, it wasn't a big success since it was considered by the German audiences to not be German enough, but it grew in acclaim over time and was a huge inspiration to a number of filmmakers, including Alfred Hitchcock. For a bit, the intertitles were said to be lost, but they were later recovered and the film was fully restored and is now available in a high-quality format. And this is gorgeous. It's a 4 from me. It's beautifully told and a good variety of stories, and it's just so visually stunning. Its cultural significance is a 2.5 though, and I may get some flack for that considering how much of a big influence it's had on filmmakers, but not so much the audience, and it just doesn't have that recognition that other Lang works have. Should you watch it? Yes, it's your density. Now that we've covered that, let's jump into 1925, and our first horror entry here is from March 16th, and it's The Monster. It begins with a car being driven off the road and a pretty impressive crash scene, and some men crawl out to check out the car, and we're told that his name is Bowman, and he's now missing. At the scene of the crash, a clue is found, and this trio, which includes an amateur detective named Johnny, are trying to crack the case. Johnny thinks that there's something about an old sanitarium, but everyone keeps insisting that it's been closed for years and isn't a factor. But Johnny keeps it up, because after all, he has a diploma for a school of detective, which sounds very official. While investigating, Johnny ends up in a tunnel while Amos and his lady friend Betty are run off the road as well, and everyone winds up at the old sanitarium. There, they meet the creepy-looking Dr. Ziska, and he claims to be in charge there, and he's played by the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. He claims to be running the show there now and introduces them to his trio of patients who remain there, but everything is then sealed off, shutting our crew inside. Some shenanigans ensue as Johnny gets drunk and they try to find a way out of the place, eventually stumbling into Ziska's dark secret. So this one was by Roland West, who we actually already encountered when I did the 30's project, as he directed a film called The Bat Whispers. But unlike a lot of the guys from this era, he wasn't doing like 10 movies a year. He only directed 14 films, and this was his 9th, so closer to the ending of his career. It was based on a play that had the same name, and is considered to be the prototype of the old dark house style of films that would become popular in the coming decades. It was also regarded as one of the very first horror comedies, what with Johnny's goofy bumbling. It was considered a disappointment when it was released, as fans were expecting more Chaney and more horror, although even though it didn't make as much money as expected, it was still the #1 movie for the week it was released, and some consider it to be the first horror film to top the box office. And this is amusing, I'll give it a 3. Chaney mugs it up for as much as he's in it, but Johnny Arthur as Johnny makes this worth watching since he's got some good comic bits going on. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's really not all that well known, but it's got Chaney and had a big influence on the spooky house genre in the coming years. Should you watch it? Sure, this monster's worth a look. Let's now go ahead a bit further into the year, and even though this one had a premiere on February 2nd, it was officially released on June 22nd, and it's The Lost World. It's got this bumbling reporter named Malone, and he's looking to be sent on a big story, but instead they send him to cover a lecture of an explorer named Challenger. Seems the guy is claiming that he's seen actual dinosaurs in uncharted areas of the Amazon, but he's mocked by his peers and is banned at the press from his appearances. He takes it all in stride, though, and dares any of those who are laughing at him to come up with him on his next expedition, and he'll show them the dinos. Malone jumps at the chance and fesses up to being a reporter, which causes the prof to flip out and leave, but he follows him to his home to beg for a chance to go, which hilariously causes him to fight him and roll down the stairs. He eventually relents, and they all head out on their journey, along with a monkey, who clearly does not want to be on camera. And a sloth that seems pretty okay with it, as most sloths are. Those suckers are camera whores. At first, they only see known animals, but then they encounter a sort of ape man, and then a pterodactyl, and look at that glorious stop motion. And they call it a pterodactyl, and I'm not much of a dinosaur expert, but it appears as if this is an error, and this is in fact a pterodon, as they're much bigger and have that crested head. There's also a brontosaurus and various other dinos just strolling about like an allosaurus and triceratops, and our heroes soon have to try to find a way out and bring back proof that the lost world ain't so lost. And this early special effects extravaganza was by Harry A. Hoyt, and would essentially be the only thing that he directed of note, but he continued writing all the way throughout the 40s. It was adapted from Arthur Conan Doyle's book of the same name from 1912, and the writer would make an appearance before the film to introduce it, although that sequence is missing from a number of versions that are out there today. It was the first full-length film to have stop-motion animation in it, and was by the legendary Willis O'Brien, who would later go on to do King Kong, which clearly took some inspiration from this story here. And it should be noted that before the film was shot, some test footage was screened for a crowd of magicians, and an ensuing newspaper article covering the event was convinced that the shots were real. It had a huge cost for the time of $700,000, and it was a big hit, earning $1.5 million. It was such a success that they were planning a remake as soon as sound film became a thing, but it didn't happen for quite a while afterwards. In fact, it took until 1960 for the film to be redone, but there's been about 5 more since then, although the Jurassic Park sequel is not connected. It simply utilizes the name as an homage. And what a fun time. I'm going with a 3.5. Like, sure, the plot is pretty damn repetitive in the entire middle of the film, but it's giving you so many cool dinos to look at. Its significance is a 4, since even if people haven't seen the whole film, so many have at least seen parts of it and know the name and those dinosaur shots. Plus, it introduced stop motion and dinosaur action to the world. Should you watch it? Yep, this should not remain lost. We now go to July 16th, and we're now about halfway through the year and have a little number called Wolf Blood. We're at this little logging company up in Canada, and did you know that logging is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world with the highest number of deaths? It has one of the highest rates of injury as well. If you're curious, delivery drivers like pizza delivery and such is number 7. Also, if you're curious, police officers are number 22. The company has a new boss in Dick Bannister, and there's a rivalry with another nearby company. There's a number of injuries at the place, much to the shock of Edith Ford, who's having a grand time dancing with her fiancé, but then they all end up heading out to inspect the place. But while they're there, Dick falls for Edith and is heartbroken to find out that she's engaged. When reports of their rivals coming into their territory increase, Dick goes to confront them, which leads to a tussle and a D being left for dead. He's injured so badly that he needs an immediate transfusion, but with no people around, the doc makes a pretty rash decision and shoots him up with wolf's blood, because why not, right? Pretty soon, though, it appears as if that blood is giving him some side effects, and when the rival loggers start getting bumped off by wolves, everyone starts to think that he's not just Dick anymore. Now, he's Werewolf Dick. The director here was George Chesborough, and was his only film that he directed, but he was a pretty prolific actor in a number of westerns up until the 50s. In fact, he has 425 acting credits to his name, although it appears as if a number of them went uncredited in the movies themselves. This one was also known as Wolf Blood, A Tale of the Forest, and some say that it's the first werewolf movie ever made, but that honor actually goes to 1913's The Werewolf, but since that one is lost, this is currently the oldest existing one. It should be noted that there's not so much of a transformation of a man into a wolf-like creature here, and the blood only gives him a wolf-like nature and makes him angrier and violent, so calling it a werewolf movie is even a little generous. And I'm giving this one a 2. Not much happens here. It takes way too long to get to the wolf blood stuff and far too much time with the less interesting romance subplot. Its significance is a 2, and it's tricky because this has notoriety for being the oldest werewolf film you can watch, but it's not the legend as we know it, and it's still a very obscure flick. Should you watch it, you can probably live without this blood in you. This next one takes us overseas for an entry that doesn't have a set release date, but it came out in Russia at some point in 1925 and played in the US in 1928, and it's The Bear's Wedding, otherwise called Marriage of the Bear. I couldn't quite find this one anywhere with English intertitles, so I had to settle for a version in Russian, and I was able to use a translator app to figure out the premise. But it opens with everyone out in the snow, with some animal cruelty towards a dog that I'll just skip over here, but it's a hunting party that encounters a bear. They shoot it dead, but another one manages to fight back and attack the Countess, who's pregnant. It gives her a good scare and tries to drag her off, but they're able to rescue her. She lives but is traumatized and gives birth shortly afterwards and is still horribly affected by that bear. As time goes on, she's unable to escape that moment and is constantly haunted by that unbearable moment until she's barely even alive. And it turns out that her son develops the odd quirk of dressing up in some sort of bear suit and heading out to attack young women. Or maybe it's not a suit at all, and he's transforming into some sort of bear creature. Well, this is brought to us by Konstantin Eggert and Vladimir Gardan and was also based on a play. That was called The Marriage of the Bear and was based on a novel called Lokis, which means bear. Like Wolf's Blood, it can be seen as an early take on a lycanthrope legend, although this time with a bear as opposed to a wolf. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of prints in existence, and the quality is rather poor, creating a dark and murky image that's quite hard to see at times. There was a point in which it was claimed to have been lost, although there were screenings of the film on Russian TV, so it's clearly been in circulation for quite a while. It's hard to say how successful it was, but the story's been adapted 2 more times, once in 1971 and the other in 1975. And I'm giving this another 2, although I think I might have a higher opinion of it if I were able to check out a better copy. It's just so hard to figure out what's going on, and not having titles I could read didn't help. But it's also a bit tedious. Its HCS is a 1.5 since it's super obscure and unspoken of, and maybe one of the earliest man transforming into an animal movies out there. Should you watch it? You could bear skipping it. Let's stay overseas and head over to Finland for a movie that came out on October 19th there, even though it's not a Finnish film, and one that got released in the US in 1931, and it's called Machiste in Hell. It begins with depictions of hell and introduces Pluto and Machiste and Barbaricia, and Pluto rules down there. He's got a real look. Everyone does, really, as these makeups are fun and over the top, and Pluto orders Barbs to try to take out Machiste, since he's a force of good. Meanwhile, the crew head out of hell and meet up with Charon and take on human form and encounter Machi. He's known for his strength and his awesome big muscles, and they try to tempt him with riches, but nothing they try works. Eventually, they steal his neighbor's baby in order to trick him, and when he comes to the child's aid, they whisk him away to hell. While there, they put him through a series of punishments, but he fights back, just like swinging demons over his head, which is pretty awesome. There's also this decree that says that a human can only remain in hell for 3 days unless he's kissed by a woman. And well, Luciferina may have something to say about that. And can we talk for a minute about how upset that I am that I didn't name my daughter Luciferina? And even though I said that this one debuted in Finland, it was actually an Italian film. It was by Guido Brignone, a man who did a large number of films starting in 1916 and stretching all the way to 1959. And he'd probably have kept going, but he died in 59. And Maciste is not just a character for this film. He appeared in several other Italian silent films, including one from 1914 and then in 26 more movies. And he was always played by Arthur Bartolomeo Pagano. It's weird because there was no consistency to the character. His films were set in various time frames and settings, and the only constant was that he was this big, strong dude who fought for good. He had a resurgence in the 50s, but since the character wasn't well known outside of Italy, in other markets they were dubbed over to become Hercules films. This particular entry even got a remake in 1962. And I enjoy this for the most part, so I'll go with a 3. It starts strong, but then gets dull for a bit, but ends up strong again. Its significance is just a 1, since it's almost entirely unknown and not one that's spoken of at all. Should you watch it? Maybe? I mean, it's pretty fun, and I love the big muscle suit from Maciste, so it's worth a peek. Here we go now with what is likely the highest profile project in this episode, because even though it had some premiere screenings earlier in the year, on November 15th, there was the wide release of The Phantom of the Opera. It's set at the swanky-danky Paris Opera House, and there's rumors there about a phantom that seems to be haunting the place, although some simply laugh it off. In the middle of a practice, some of the dancers spot him and claim he was noseless, or maybe had a giant nose, and I love that they're so freaked out by it all that they can't help but pirouette. Their prima donna is a woman named Carlotta, and she gets a letter from a phantom saying that she must allow her understudy Christine to sing in her place, but she refuses. It seems the mysterious one has taken a liking to Christine and is trying to further her career, and when Carlotta continues to go on, the phantom drops a whole-ass chandelier on the crowd. Afterwards, Christine follows a hidden door behind her mirror and comes face to face with the Phantom, wearing a mask that isn't quite what you think of when you picture this guy, and he leads her down into the sewers to keep her locked up in his lair. Of course, her disappearance is noted and they start looking for her, and her curiosity about what's under that mask gets the better of her, leading to one of the greatest reveals in cinema history. And this is, of course, an adaptation of the 1909 tale from Gaston Leroux, The Phantom of the Opera, and this was the second attempt at bringing it to life, and the first being in 1916, which is now lost. It was from Universal, and the head of the company, Carl Lommel, met Leroux in 1922, and he gave him a copy of the book, which he read in one night, and immediately brought the rights to do a film version. The director was Rupert Julian, who had been in film since 1914, and we encountered him sort of in the 1930s project, since his final film was The Cat Creeps, a horror flick from 1930 that is now lost. Of course, Lon Chaney was hired as the Phantom, as he was the leading horror star at that time, and that was the start of some problems, since he didn't get along with Julian on set, and the two fought to the point of not speaking to each other, and there required a middleman to deliver direction to the star, which Chaney then promptly ignored. They also changed the ending during filming, as the studio thought that the original novel ending was too low-key and wanted something more dramatic. But when they wrapped up filming, more problems arose. An early test screening was super negative, complaining about the melodrama and wanted more humor and hated the new ending. Then they went back into production, did a number of reshoots without Julian involved, adding some comic relief. And when that version had a test screening, well, that didn't go well either, and the film was booed loudly. They went back in and edited it down, cutting out a number of the new scenes and restoring a good deal of things that were removed, but kept the new ending. With all of this, the critical reaction was pretty mixed, but it did well at the box office, and audiences were shocked and fainted at the reveal of the Phantom's face. There would be multiple versions of the film, including some sound versions and color restoration, and the Phantom would then live on in a large number of remakes and readaptations, and even Universal took a second shot of it in the 1940s. The character really broke out with the musical version, which reached massive status and catapulted the story into the mainstream even more. And I like it, but I also agree that this is a fairly uneven version of the tale, so I'm going to go with a 3.5. The stuff that's great is wonderful, but it also doesn't seem to know what it wants to be at times, likely the result of the reshoots. Its significance is a 4.5 though, since it's probably the most well-known version of the story in terms of film, and everyone recognizes that shot of his face, but I also feel like the public's main knowledge for the character is not really from this particular version. Should you watch it? Yes, because if you don't, in sleep, he'll sing to you. We're heading into 1926 now, and the first film we're going to check out is from March 14th, although that was a premiere, and it went wider 1 week later on the 21st, and it's The Bat. We meet Gideon, a man who loves rare jewels, and he gets a letter from the Bat saying that he's going to steal his emeralds that night. Of course, Gideon prepares for him, but to no avail since he's found dead, and the Bat leaves a note saying that he's headed to the country. He dresses like a bat, and we see him busting into places with those crazy ears, which seems like a silly idea, really. Like, as a burglar, wouldn't you want to be less inconspicuous? There's this big estate out there being rented by Cornelia Van Gorder, a writer who's there for the summer, and they're on the lookout for the Bat, placing bear traps out for him with the wacky comic relief maid. But then there's Richard, Cornelia's nephew. He's got some money troubles. He wants to lease out the mansion, but with her there, he can't. Pretty soon, there's letters showing up warning them to get out, so it seems like the Bat may be at hand. Or is he? When Richard gets shot, the police try to find a hidden room that's somewhere in the premises where it's said that a stash of money stolen from the bank may be hidden, and it appears as if the man himself is on hand, or at least someone dressed as him. And this one is from Roland West, the same man who did The Monster from earlier in this episode. It was based on a play called The Bat by Mary Roberts Reinhardt, and was indeed the second time that it was adopted, because even in the 20s, everything is based on something or a remake of something. The filming was a little unusual for an American picture, since there was a good deal of care placed into the sets and shot setups, seemingly taking inspiration from the German Expressionism films at the time. In order to achieve a spookier feel, they insisted on shooting only at night. When it was released, it was a huge hit, and although there aren't any official numbers, it was referred to as a box office knockout. For a while, it was thought to be lost, but thankfully, in the 80s, someone discovered a print, and it was once again available to view. One person who saw it before it was thought lost, though, was Bob Kane, who said that this was one of his inspirations for taking the credit for Batman away from Bill Finger. I mean creating Batman. Also, this became known as West's biggest hit, and was so enamored with the concept that in 1930 he remade it as The Bat Whispers, with sound, and that version was also successful, but not as much as this one was. And this is another 3.5. The story's a little humdrum, and there's too much walking around, but holy cow is it pretty. The shots are just gorgeous and really take advantage of the shadows on hand. Its significance is a 2, since it did have some notoriety in its day and clearly had an influence on one Caped Crusader, but it's never really pushed much higher in recognition than that. Should you watch it? You should, chum. Put it on at the same bat time, the same bat channel. Just a few days later, on March 25th, we had another US premiere with an entry with a similar tone, and it's Midnight Faces. It begins with a house in the Florida Bayou, which used to belong to Peter Martin, but he's since died. His nephew, Lynn, inherits the place, and he heads there by canoe, because all the best spooky houses are only accessible by boat, and he's accompanied by his lawyer and his servus Trohelius. No one has been there since Peter died, but there's a bunch of black candles all around and also a mysterious man lurking about. The staff arrives, including Lund, who is confined to a wheelchair, and right afterwards, a young woman appears, screaming for help. She claims that a man has chased her there, although they suspect that she may be only after Lynn's money, but things get dangerous when someone tries to poison them. And I don't know, maybe it's this guy all done up like the Shadow or whatever, but is Mary what she appears, or is she up to no good? And who keeps knocking on the walls? And, can Trohelius just not be such a racist caricature? And this is a pretty early version of the old Dark House film, essentially the same genre as The Bat, and this was by Bennett Cohen, and was only his second directing gig. He'd go on to do a handful more films through 1934, but then stopped to focus on writing, and he has 192 writing credits as opposed to 16 directing ones. By this point, there have been several of this brand of film, sort of following the same formula, down to the inclusion of the bumbling manservant. But it didn't make all that much of an impact, and was mostly hailed as being a ripoff. And it's fine, I guess. I'll give it a 2. I think because I watched it back-to-back with The Bat, and that film did the same thing, but way better, this one just felt dull and flat with an easy-to-solve mystery. Its significance is just a 1 since no one's heard of this, and there's no names involved, and it certainly didn't impact the genre since it's just doing what other films had already done. Should you watch it? You don't need to face this one. We're now headed overseas for this one, which debuted in Tokyo on July 10th. It didn't get a run in the US until 1975, and it's called A Page of Madness. It has opening credits in which you can actually see someone turning the page, and then a dark and stormy night. As the downpour rages, we get flashes of imagery rapid fire, including a woman dancing inside of a cell, who seems to envision herself very differently. Next to her is another woman who mainly lays on the floor, and she's looked in on by an older man who turns out to be her husband, but she doesn't remember him. His family is very concerned about them as they blame him for his mother's condition, which seems to be getting increasingly worse. When the dancing patient gets everyone all riled up, a massive fight breaks out, causing chaos and getting the husband, who's the janitor there by the way, in trouble with the head doctor. Afterwards, he goes home and proceeds to have a series of visions about success and murder. Now, this looks pretty bizarre, and let me tell you, it is. It was directed by Hinosuke Kinugasa and was a group creation. It seems that there was this coalition of avant-garde artists known as the Shinkankuha, which translates to School of New Perceptions. Their whole thing was escaping naturalism, which was a movement that tried to create an illusion of reality through different elements, but this whole film was about going against that and making a more abstract impression. The screenplay is credited to Yasunari Kawabata, who won a Nobel Prize in Literature for his prose works in 1968. But it's also said that he was not the sole writer, and the script was a collaboration between him and several others on the crew. It doesn't feature intertitles, and the common practice at the time in Japan was to play the film while a narrator would flesh out the story with a live musical accompaniment. It was a massive hit over there, so much so that it crossed an important line. In this era, there were 2 types of movie houses in Japan. Those that showed exclusively domestic films, and those that did foreign films. This one was such a hit that they played it in both theaters, which was a relief to Kinugasa, who was bankrupt before the release. Not that long after its run, it was thought lost, though, and would remain that way for 45 years, until 1971, when the director was clearing out a storage cabin and stumbled upon a print in a rice barrel. Unfortunately, the surviving version is missing footage, and about a third of it is thought to be lost forever. And this one's wild. I'm going with a 3.5 on this. It's a bit hard to get into because of the lack of titles and narration, but it's just so damn pretty, and those strange images are a treat. Its significance is just a 1, though, since it's not well known over here at all and is not often spoke about. It likely has more significance in its home country, though.
Should you watch it? Yes. I mean, if you dug Tetsuo the Iron Man, this feels like a visual forerunner in a way. This next one was back in the US, and we're fast forwarding a bit now to September 15th, and it's The Bells. It has Matthias here, and he's running an inn and hoping to be the burgomaster of their little town in Austria. And when I was younger, I thought they were saying burgermaster in movies, and holy crap, that I want to be the town burgermaster. It seems like a great job, but instead, a burgomaster is just a mayor, much less rad. Matthias has been letting people eat on credit, but then not collecting on that credit, and is quickly going broke, much to the delight of Franz, the guy he owes the money to. Seems Franz wants the inn for himself, and Matthias is none other than Lionel Barrymore, and this is the first time that we're seeing him on the project, although we've seen his brother John. Meanwhile, Matthias has a daughter named Annette, and she's so silly, just like hiding out in a bunch of hay, and Franz wants to marry her, so he says that he'll delete his debt if he arranges a marriage. One day, a mesmerist rolls into town, and this is a pretty big occasion since this is the first horror appearance for none other than Boris Karloff. At this point, he was in a bunch of films, but hadn't really claimed that crown of being known for spooky stuff yet. But things take a turn when a merchant enters the inn one night and has a money belt full of gold, so Matthias follows him out into the snow and kills him. But before he dies, the man shakes some bells at him, which then haunt Matthias at every turn. This one was directed by James Young, and this was one of his final films, although between 1912 and 1928, he's credited with 93 films. This one was based on a stage play called The Polish Jew, as the man with the belt is referred to as that in the film, and this was the 5th version of the story put on screen, although only the 2nd in the US. It would later be remade again in 1931 and in 1935. I guess, in a way, it's also the first Christmas-themed horror film, even though it's not like it's a major part of the story or anything, it's just when it's set. And even though it's mostly a kind of crime thriller, it's got haunting and ghosts and some early special effects. And I'll go with a 2.5 on this. It starts off great, but then just feels really repetitious after a while and takes too long to get to the point. Its significance is a 2, since it's not really spoken of all that much, but it's what I believe to be the first Christmas horror, and the first horror appearance by Karloff. Should you watch it? Depends. I mean, it's not bad, but it'll be okay to leave these bells unrung. Let's go over to Denmark now for a film that's debuted there on September 20th, although it's a German film, and did get released in the US a little later in the year on December 5th, and it's Faust. It's got the devil, and he's pretty ticked off about man being on Earth and whatnot, and he makes a deal with an archangel that he can corrupt the soul of a good man, and if he wins, he gets the whole planet. He shows up over this town, and I mean, like, look at this. This is awesome. And he lets loose a plague that ravages through everyone, which is less awesome. In the village, there's an old man named Faust, and even though he prays for help, there is none. So he makes a big decision and instead asks Mephisto for help instead. He shows up at his house and makes him a deal for his soul, which makes M pretty happy, and he uses that power to help people, but they shun him when the cross repels him. He then makes a further deal to become young again, and he's offered a woman and some early film nudity. He then takes Faust to meet the woman of his dreams while murdering her groom. Faust then becomes indebted to eternity while going about his newfound youth and trying to find love with young Gretchen. But is it too late for his soul? So this one is an adaptation of an ancient tale, most prominently told in an 1808 version by Goethe, but this telling differs quite a bit from the source. It was by the great F.W. Murnau of Nosferatu fame, and it was the last German film that he would do before heading off to Hollywood to do features there. It was one of the most expensive and visually elaborate German films of the era and cost 2 million Reichsmark. It was more complicated than normal because they used multiple cameras instead of just one, which was standard at the time, and reportedly did more
and longer takes than normal. Because he had delivered a big hit with a film called The Last Laugh, a dramatic film, the studio had essentially given him an unlimited budget and freedom to do what he wanted. The shoot was also longer than normal and went on for 2 months in a time when the general time frame for filming was a month or less. Plus, Murnau ended up making multiple versions and cuts of the film, each one differing quite a bit. Like, for instance, in one version, there's a bear and they use an actual bear, but in another version, it's a guy in a costume. There's said to be 5 different versions out there. But when it was released, it was a flop. Critics didn't like it and only ended up making back around half of its budget. Since then, though, it's taken on a reputation for being a gorgeous example of German expressionistic filmmaking and creating innovative special effects. And this one's pretty solid, so it gets a 3.5. Visually, it's a knockout and features some amazing set design. The story does feel a little sluggish for a good portion of it though, and the middle of it drags, but it's never not pretty. Its HCS is a 3 since it's a somewhat well-known take on the tale and a classic director, but it's another that's likely more important in its home country than it is here. Should you watch it? Yes, just don't expect anyone in a superhero costume. Our final film of this episode arrived on October 24th, and we're closing it back in the USA with The Magician. We're in a Latin quarter of Paris, and we meet a sculptor named Margaret, and she's working on this statue, but part of it collapses down and falls on top of her. Her spine is injured, and she suffers from a total paralysis and undergoes an experimental surgery to try and reverse it. A bunch of doctors observe, including, for some reason, Oliver Haddo, a hypnotist and magician. He's been searching for some sort of alchemy formula for creating human life, and one of the ingredients is the heart blood of a maiden, and he decides that the maiden of choice is Margaret. She recovers from her surgery and starts dating her doctor, which seems very, not a good decision, Doc. But they encounter Haddo, and he's able to magically cure a snake bite. Later on, he hypnotizes Margaret, and here's where things go a little wild since he sees Pan manifest and a wild orgy in hell. And I say orgy, but it's mainly people running around, and oh, Conan is here with the Wheel of Pain. She's horrified by the experience and tries to have Arthur, who she's engaged now to, protect her, but Haddo clearly isn't letting her get away. Her and her maiden heart blood. And this one is from Rex Ingram. He wasn't extremely prolific, but he did do 30 movies between 1914 and 1932. And I know that sounds like a lot, but his contemporaries were churning out around 4 times that. It was another that was based on a previous work and was an adaptation of a novel from 1908 called The Magician by W. Somerset Maugham. It was apparently a difficult shoot, and Ingram cast his wife in the lead role, but she did quite well. And it was Paul Wegener, who played Haddo, who was very difficult on set. He would often yell at people, and the other actors were unimpressed with what he was doing. Also, Ingram is said to have lost interest in the product in mid-production and let other people direct segments that he found dull, which is why he's not really given a director's credit, and instead it says, supervised by Rex Ingram. It was pretty acclaimed on its release, although there's not much info about the box office, but it was then lost for decades. It was at one point considered one of the most sought-after lost films out there, but after a while, multiple prints were found, and it was available to view. Even then, for a bit, it was only shown on theatrical screenings and a few cable runs, and it took until 2011 for it to get any sort of a home release. And this is decent, so it gets a 3. It's weird because the ending of this movie feels like a whole different thing from the beginning, and I wish it had more of that going on earlier. Its significance is a 2, though, since it's not much spoken of and clearly didn't impact a whole lot since it was lost for so long, but it did influence Frankenstein some, so it has some relevance. Should you watch it? Sure, this magic show is pretty worth it.
We're going into 1927 here with one of the biggest films of the era, one that debuted in Berlin on January 10th and was released in the US a little later on March 14th, but it's Metropolis. We're set in a big city with a number of cattle-like workers marching to and from work. Meanwhile, up on top of the massive skyscrapers is the wealthy elite, who live a far more carefree lifestyle, and there's this garden where concubines await them. A school teacher named Maria brings a bunch of the workers' children up there to see how the other half lives, which appalls the rich freighter, because how dare those filthies interrupt their good time. Freighter, who's the son of the city's master, is fascinated by her, though, and goes off in search of her. While down in the city, he sees a big explosion and has a hallucination about workers being fed to it, and runs to tell his father what he witnessed. Not surprisingly, his father doesn't care, because even in the 20s, corporate CEOs were uncaring dicks. Freighter becomes disillusioned with his pops and decides to fight for the workers and goes to work in the city. We then meet an inventor named Rotwang, and he meets with Fredersen to discuss his dead love, Hel, who left Rotwang to marry the master. He tells her that she lives on in a robot form that he's created and plans to give her a human-like skin so no one can tell the difference between his robots and people. Turns out that Maria is actually sort of a leader of the worker rebellion, and when Fredersen and Rotwang see what she's up to and the fact that Freighter is in love with her, they form a romance. Rotwang then kidnaps her, and their plan is for Rotwang to make the robot into Maria, and Fredersen wants to use it to stop the workers from uprising, but Rotwang plans to backstab him and bring it all down. And can I talk for a second about how confusing it is to have the master be Fredersen and his son to just be Freighter? Like, shouldn't the kid be Freighter's son? Whatever, but he enacts his plan, stealing the lovely Maria's face for his robot as it enacts their plans. Well, someone's plans. And this is from returning 20's Project alum Fritz Lang, and he previously appeared here with Destiny, a film that was recently rediscovered, and I covered him in the 30's Project with M. But this is widely considered to be his masterpiece. It was written by novelist Thea von Harbo, and she was adapting her own novel of the same name from 1925. Her and Lang were married and worked on this together, going through a number of different versions of the script until reaching the version that was filmed. It was a really expensive, demanding, and lengthy shoot, and a large number of the cast and crew grew to resent Lang for his demanding style. It was a very expensive film for the time period, running over 5 million Reichsmarks, which is said to be the equivalent of around 21 million euros, so this was really pricey. However, the responses to the film were extremely mixed upon release. It was said to be too long at about 2.5 hours, with the American release trimming out around a half hour of material. It actually didn't do that well at the box office either, but it's not been called a bomb. But over time, it's become one of the most influential and important films in cinema history. Its shadow can be seen in modern visual stylings, social commentary, and special effects. So many different versions exist with alternate cuts and scores, including one from 1984 from Giorgio Moroder that had Freddie Mercury, Adam Ant, and Pat Benatar singing on it. It's also been adapted into a theatrical play, a manga and anime version, and almost had a TV series remake. It was meant for Apple TV Plus and was moving forward, but ended up getting canceled due to the 2023's writer's strike. And what a masterpiece. This is so stunning to look at and a great story. It's a 4.5 from me. Like, this may have been my first silent movie, or at least the first that I remember, and it just stuck with me, and I still can't believe they pulled off a number of these shots. It's outstanding. Its horror-cultural significance is the same, since it's instantly recognizable in terms of Maria being one of the most famous robots in film, and its influence is vast, and the only reason I don't give it a 5 is that I don't think that many people have seen it as opposed to just being familiar with it. Should you watch it? Definitely. Oh, and workers unite!
We now go to one that was released on June 4th but had a premiere on May 29th, and it's The Unknown. So if you're the Scottish Willy Wonka, beware. And I feel like that joke is about 15 minutes too late. We're at a circus, and the star performer is a guy named Alonzo the Armless. And would you believe it? He has no arms. He uses his feet to throw knives at his partner, and Alonzo is once again Lon Chaney. So we've seen him in a movie with no legs, and now no arms. And his partner, Nanon, is none other than Blanche, and she's not Natcha in this movie. She digs Alonzo because men have always groped at her against her will, and, well, Alonzo can't. But she's smitten with Malabar, the strong man, even though he's kind of scrawny. Like, am I crazy? This guy does not look like a big tough guy. Alonzo has a friend in Chris Kattan, or I guess Kojo. But wait, it turns out that Alonzo ain't so armless after all, and it's all a scam. Not only does he have hands, but one of them has a double thumb, which is like a twist on a twist. Seems like that's his distinguishing feature, so he hides his arms so that the police can identify him because, oh yeah, he's on the run. But the circus owner, Nanon's dad, discovers his secret, so he kills him. She sees it go down and sees the double thumb, but not his face, and the police move in to find their man, while the love triangle heats up to the point that the dude has his arms surgically removed, while at the same time, Nanon covers her arm fear. Whoops! And yeah, this wacky little film, marked as an early example of body horror, was actually from Todd Browning, the man who would go on to direct Dracula and Freaks. It was originally meant to star Greta Garbo, but instead ended up casting Crawford, who was only 18 at the time, although possibly 21 depending upon the truth of her age. She claimed that this film was her turning point of understanding what acting was, as opposed to just being in front of a camera, and strive to be a better actress after this point. Apparently, the story was based on an actual incident from Browning's past, as he traveled with the circus in his youth, leading to this film, and then later Freaks, and there, a man evaded police by posing as one of the acrobats. It was a massive critical success and made a ton of money, earning $800,000 against a budget of $200,000. Unfortunately, it was then lost and was missing for decades. In 1968, they found a print, although it's thought that there are several scenes missing. Some of the scenes have been found, and there's now a new restoration that runs a little over an hour, as opposed to the 49-minute version that's been around. One thing that's interesting is that the character of Kojo simply disappears from the film, and in the original script was killed by Alonzo, although it seems like the scene was never actually shot. And this was pretty great. I'm giving this a 4. Like, it pulls you in with this crazy story, and it never quite goes in the directions that you think that it will. Its horror cultural significance is just a 2.5 though, because it's still, pardon the pun, a bit unknown. But it was a major role for Chaney, was a success at the time, and had early Crawford in it, but never really hit that mainstream acceptance. Should you watch it? Yeah, it's disarmingly enjoyable. We jump now to August 14th for the premiere of a film that would then get a larger release on September 9th, and the title will sound familiar if you also watch the 30's project because it's The Cat and the Canary. We're set in this big spooky mansion overlooking the Hudson River and its elderly owner Cyrus West, who's on the brink of death. He views his family hungry for his inheritance as cats around a canary, and there's cats here, so more points to this movie. His will states that it'll remain locked in a safe until 20 years after his death, and that time passes, with his ghost said to be roaming the grounds. On the night of the reading, the family lawyer, Mr. Crosby, arrives, led in by the maid, Mammy Pleasant, who really is not that at all. In the safe, not only is there the will, but there's a mysterious second will to be opened if the terms of the first one are not met. Then, the family arrives, and they've read off the will, and most of the money is given to a distant relative named Annabelle. But there's a stipulation in there that says that the inheritor must remain sane, and if a physician would deem her not to be, then the money would go to another person named in that second will.
But then, a man from a nearby mental institution comes in and says he's on the search for an escaped lunatic who was last seen entering the house, and he's known as the Cat. And it seems like he's on the prowl, snagging Mr. Crosby before he can say who the other heir is. Although no one quite believes Annabelle and thinks she may be as mad as old Mr. West. And this is from Paul Lenny, who we last saw back in 1924 with Waxworks. And he'd only make a few more movies after this, including one that we'll discuss later in this episode. Like the one I covered in the 30s, this was based on a play from 1922 with the same name by John Willard. It was a part of a run of old dark house films that were kicked off by a thriller from 1922 called One Exciting Night, and was produced by Carl Laemmle, then head of Universal. He really wanted to do a version of the play, although Willard was hesitant because he figured the film would ruin the ending of the play and no one would want to come to see it anymore. But he did it anyway, and Lenny was chosen as the director, as they were impressed by his German expressionistic films, although he brought a far more muted version of it here. It was a hit at the box office and was critically acclaimed, and it's considered the actual start of the spooky house horror movies, even if there were others before it, but this really established the formula that later films would adopt. It would go on to be done 5 more times, including the 1930 film The Cat Creeps and that 39 version with Bob Hope, which has become the most known take. And I'll give this one a 3.5. It's the OG of this type of film, even if it's a bit overly long and repetitive at times, but it's a great mix of mood and comedy. Its HCS is a 3 since it's a known title, the first take on a classic story, and is seen as the kickoff of an entire genre, although it's still not a widely seen film. Should you watch it? Yes, there's cats in it. This next one takes us overseas again, and this one did debut in Berlin on Halloween, October 31st, and had a New York screening in June of 1928, and it's The Strange Case of Captain Ramper. It begins with said captain preparing for a flight headed over the Arctic. Unfortunately, the plane crashes, leaving Ramper and his co-pilot, Ipling, stranded in the cold. They're up there for 3 years living off the stories of a previous expedition, but eventually Ipling dies of his wounds, and Ramping goes into animal mode. But then there's a bunch of whalers up there, and he attacks them, and they actually think that he's a Yeti, and I'm not sure I blame them when he's sporting this getup. They then team up and capture him, taking him back to the mainland and selling him off to a circus, even though they figure out that he's just some dude. They show him as Teddy the Man-Ape, and it's only 10 cents to see him, which in 1927 money, I think is around like $900 or something. A woman named Tony is assigned to train him, and he falls in love with her while some try to exploit him and others try to restore his mental health. And this one is from Max Reichmann, a German director, and is considered to be the first film about the Yeti or Bigfoot legend. It features a few recurring faces, since Captain Ramper is played by Paul Wegener, although here he's mostly covered with fur on his face, but we saw him previously in The Golem as the Golem. Also, Nosferatu himself, Max Schreck, is in here, although he's also hard to recognize since he's not in any makeup. This was based on a play that was called Ramper by a man named Max Marr, and it did well enough to get an American release where it was re-edited a bit and given a different prologue. For a very long time, the film was thought to be lost and there were only photographs remaining, but then a print was discovered. However, the final 10 minutes of the movie were not included on the reel of the print, so the version that exists is only around 50 minutes. It's said that the final act was centered on Ramper not knowing what to do, deciding between rejoining society or returning to the North Pole to live out his life as a Yeti. But as it stands, the film instead just kind of ends. And this is okay. I'll give it a 2.5 with the caveat that it's hard to judge as it exists since it's an incomplete film. If it still had the ending and an actual resolution to the storyline, I might have increased that. Its significance is a 1.5 since it's pretty much completely unknown and was thought lost for such a long time, but it did have some horror faces and was the first Yeti film. Should you watch it? I'd wait to see if they discover that final reel. This next one debuted on November 5th and went a little wider on the 13th, but this was called The Gorilla. It was by Alfred Santel and was an adaptation of a play of that name that was written on a bet. The playwright, Ralph Spence, made a bet that he could write a play in only 3 days, and then The Gorilla came out of it. It ended up being a nice success, and a film version was ordered not long afterwards, and would be done again in 1930 and 1939, and the 30 version is lost. This version was also lost for ages, but was recently discovered and restored. It was screened at a film festival in 2024, although it's not yet available for a wider audience, so possibly in the near future, this is one that can be revisited. Just a little later, on November 27th, there was a New York premiere for a film that would get a slightly wider release on December 11th, and it was The Wizard. This was based on yet another Gaston Leroux story, the man responsible for the Phantom of the Opera, and this one was from 1911 and called Bala-Oo. It's about an evil doctor who grafts a human face onto an ape and has it go out and kidnap people for him to torture and murder. It was by Richard Rawson, the director of the original 1932 version of Scarface, and that's your cue to say, I never knew that Scarface was a remake in the comments. When it was released, it wasn't well reviewed, although nothing was overly negative, but it then became a lost film, and no known prints exist. Another version was done, leaning heavier on the mystery elements, in 1942 called Dr. Renault's Secret. We round out 27 with The Big One, a film that was released on December 3rd, and it's the infamous London After Midnight. This is another one that was from Todd Browning, and another in which he collaborated with Lon Chaney. It was based on a short story called The Hypnotist, which was by Browning as well, although the script was adapted by Waldemar Young. It's about a man named Roger who is found dead, his death declared a suicide, and 5 years later, his mansion is now haunted by a strange figure in a beaver top hat with long hair and pointed teeth. He's joined by a slender woman wearing a dark gown, and their presence causes the locals some stress, but perhaps things aren't what they seem. One of the most noted parts of the film is Chaney's makeup, which has become an iconic look, using small wire fittings that held his eyes open in a creepy fashion. It was a big hit in its day, even if it got mixed reviews, but in 1965, the last surviving known copy was destroyed in a fire in the MGM vaults, along with a number of other rare films. Because of this, it's become one of the most sought-after lost films in existence, or non-existence as it were, and it was remade by Browning with Bela Lugosi in the Chaney role in 1935 under the title Mark of the Vampire, and the look of the character has influenced a lot of villains, most famously the Babadook. There's been several attempts to reconstruct the film using stills and recreations, and even an audio version based on the original script. Let's move into 1928 now, and this next entry is one that's not lost, and it was released on January 25th in Germany, and did get a US run sometime in May, and it's Al-Ran, or A Daughter of Destiny. It opens on a professor giving a lecture, and it's Paul Wegener again, who we just saw in Captain Ramper, but he's more recognizable here. He hands out tiny bunnies to everyone, so bonus to him, and he's discussing an experiment in which he plans to create a human that would not have any genetic traits of their parents. He intends to use mandrake, a type of herb, to impregnate a woman he considers to be of low social status. They perform the experiment on a prostitute, and a child is conceived, and they name her Al-Ran. The professor adopts her and finds out that she's troubled, so he sends her off to a convent, but even there, she's sneaking around with boys and pulling pranks. Eventually, she asks her boyfriend to steal money so that they can elope, and they take off on a train, where she catches the eye of a circus troupe and becomes a magician's assistant. There, she continues to act out and flirt with any man that she comes into contact with, but eventually, the professor catches up to her in an effort to rein in his creation. And this is another from Germany, and it's directed by Henrik Galeen. And he had a pretty storied past because he was the writer of Nosferatu and the co-director of The Golem. So he's been involved with a few films that we've covered, but this is the first time for directing solo. And I know that I mentioned Wegener, but Alran is actually Bridget Helm, who we just saw as Maria in Metropolis. The story here is based on a novel from 1911. It was also called Alran, which is German for Mandrake actually, and was written by Hans Heinz Ewers. And it was based on a myth from the Middle Ages about a human-shaped mandrake root. Weird note about Ewers is that he became involved with the Nazis in the early 30s and liked a portion of their policies and their love of country, but disagreed with their anti-Semitism. And combined with the fact that he was gay and in the closet, he was soon ousted from the party, and his works were banned in Germany because who would have thought that the leopards would eat his face? The movie did quite well with the critics, who praised Helm and Wegener, and quite a bit has been made about the overt sexuality in the film and the low-key eroticism present within. There was a remake in 1929, this time by Richard Oswald, and this time with sound. And I like this, but it's a touch slow, so I'll go with a 3. There's just too much in the middle act that's somewhat unnecessary to the main story drive that brings it down. Its significance is just a 1 since it's very little known and not much spoken of except to talk about Helm or Wegener. Should you watch it? Yeah, I'd give it a go. It's interesting for its early sauciness. So the next one is pretty damn important and actually debuted in 2 different versions. First on September 6th and then October 20th, and it's The Terror. The 2 different versions were important since the earlier version was in sound, with the October one being silent. And yes, that's right, this is officially the first all-talking horror film, the second sound film released from Warner Brothers, and was based on a play of the same name from 1927. The plot involves a killer known as the Terror lurking on an old inn and playing havoc on the residents there, and was directed by Roy Del Ruth. And he'd been in the game since 1915, but it's the first time that we're seeing him. But he's the man who would go on to make The Maltese Falcon and wouldn't return to anything horror related until the 1950s. It got some fairly negative reviews at the time, with one critic saying that it was so bad that it was almost suicidal. However, it did make quite a bit of money, earning around $1.5 million, while costing only $163,000. 2 versions had to be released since a large number of theaters weren't converted over to sound yet, but both versions have been said to be lost since sometime in the 70s, although the sound recording discs are still around and are preserved in the archives. It got a couple of remakes, the first in 1934, with yet another version in 1938, and again in 1965, although these swung more heavily into the crime aspect of the film. Now we travel on over to France for a film that debuted there on October 5th, and it's one with a familiar title, and The Fall of the House of Usher. It has a man being summoned by his friend Roderick Usher to come up to his house, and I wonder if that thing is gonna fall. When he arrives, he finds Usher obsessed with painting this big portrait of Madeline, his wife, who's dying. Unfortunately, the doc can't do anything for her, and it turns out that all of the Ushers have painted their wives, and it turns out that his own degeneracy has led to the end of his family line. He keeps on painting, though, as Madeline gets weaker and weaker until she collapses. Roderick is also obsessed with magnets, but since no one knows how they work, she dies anyway. He refuses to allow anyone to take her away and demands that she be buried in the family crypt and insists that they don't nail her coffin shut. And they take her to the crypt, and I swear to you that then there's multiple shots of frogs having sex. I can't say for certain that that's what's going on, but it sure looks that way, although I'm no expert on frog boning. Like, do frogs bone? I know frogs have bones. But then, alone in his mansion, old Roddy seems haunted by the memory of his wife, the possibility that she's still with him. But is she? And Yes, this is an adaptation of the classic Edgar Allan Poe story called Fall of the House of Usher from 1939, which means this story was already close to 100 years old when they made this. It was directed by Jean Epstein, a Polish director, but it was co-written by Luis Buñuel, and I'm hoping that we leave everyone's eyeballs alone here, please. Buñuel would go on to become a massively influential director with Wuthering Heights, Belle du Jour, and the underrated Exterminating Angel. This was only his second film credit, with his first also being a collaboration with Epstein, but as they had a falling out during this film, Buñuel left and went on to his own works. Its biggest change is switching the relationship between Roderick and Madeline, since in the Poe story they're brother and sister, as opposed to husband and wife here. It was massively acclaimed and earned quite a bit of praise at the time, but also as time went on, with it being cheered for its experimental and yet accessible storytelling. And this is a mood. I'm giving it a 4. This movie pretty much captures what reading Poe feels like. It's dreamy, dark aesthetic, and the shadows, like all the shadows. It's so pretty, and you get pulled right in. Its significance is a 3.5 since it's a really renowned take on a renowned story, although it's not one that reached a massive mainstream success outside of a film lover's world. Should you watch it? Yes, and spoiler alert, the house falls. We're back in the US for our next entry, which was released on November 4th, and this one is The Haunted House. It was sort of a hybrid film between silence and sound, since it had a synced music score that would accompany the film, although no talking from the characters on screen. It was from Benjamin Christensen, the man who gave us Haxan, and was about a group of people in an old dark house for a will reading and the spooky events that happen afterwards, which can describe a lot of films from this era, some from this very episode. Much like The Terror, though, all copies of the film have been lost, with only the sound discs still remaining. Our final film of 1928 was one that debuted first in London on December 18th, but then arrived in the US theaters 1 week later on Christmas Day, and it's The Last Warning. We're on Broadway, and during a stage performance, one of the actors just dies, and the police arrive to investigate. They discover the scent of chloroform and talk to the lead actress, played by Laura LaPlante, who we saw not that long ago in Cat and the Canary. It seems like the deceased John was quite smitten with her, and it seemed like there was some sort of love triangle between them and Harvey, another actor. But then the body disappears, and 5 years pass, with the theater closing due to the scandal. But the play's producer, Arthur, decides to try to solve the mystery in a wild way by doing the play again with the original cast and reenacting the murder. Everyone arrives and spooky stuff starts to happen, including a telegram that serves as some sort of a last warning. It seems like someone is tampering with things on set too, and that wacky old Barbara. Things escalate and signs point to Doris being involved in the shenanigans. But it also seems like someone else is there too. Someone who looks suspiciously like John Woodford. And this one's interesting. It's another from Paul Lemmy, and we just talked about him with The Cat and the Canary, and after that one was a big success, Universal hired him for this, hoping that it would also do well. It was based on a play from 1922, and here's the weird part. This was partially a sound film. Originally, it had sequences with a few minutes worth of dialogue and talking, and like The Terror, was released both with and without sound to accommodate theaters without audio. However, over time, the version of the film with sound is now lost, and only the silent version remains. It had reviews that were all over the place, and some even criticized the sound, saying it actually detracted from the overall film, but there was also some lambasting of the all-over-the-place storyline. It seems as if it did quite well, although there would be no follow-up successes for Lenny, as he died of blood poisoning just a few months later in the middle of 1929. And this is pretty fun. I'll go with a 3. I like the whole play aspect of it, but the story does go all over the place and it never truly clicks with the direction. Its HCS is a 1.5 since it's not much well known, doesn't really have any known names with it, and didn't have the impact that other films with a similar tone did. Should you watch it? You should, and that's not your final warning. Our first film of 1929, our final year of the decade, sadly can't be viewed. It debuted on January 27th in the US in a silent version and on February 17th with sound, and it's 7 Footprints to Satan. This is another one from Haxon and the Haunted House director Benjamin Christensen, and it was an adaptation of a book, and also had several sequences with dialogue and talk sequences. It was actually a flop and was poorly reviewed, and the author of the original book it was based on blamed the film for ruining further book sales. It's not lost, but the only version that remains is one referred to as the International Sound version, although the sound discs no longer exist. The surviving version is stored at the Cineteca Italiana and is currently not available to view. The next one is another from Germany and arrived on February 7th in Berlin, and it's Somnambul, otherwise known as The Somnambulist. It was by German director Adolf Trotz and features an actual clairvoyant, person claiming to be an actual clairvoyant, and is another one that is now lost. This next one is an American film, but it first premiered in Austria on April 19th and got its American run a little later in October 13th, and it's The Last Performance. We kick things off at a circus, and nearby there's a popular magician named Eric the Great, and he's Conrad Veidt, whose name I am definitely pronouncing correctly, but if not, make sure to tell me in the comments. We get to see him do a couple of tricks on stage, and one is an act of hypnotism. He's smitten with his young assistant, and she's played by Mary Philbin, who you might recognize from the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, where she was Christine, and this was one of her final roles. She never reached a level of stardom that her success in Phantom would indicate, and she left Hollywood in 1930 and became a recluse, not making a public appearance until 1988. One night, he catches a thief named Mark in his place, and Julie takes pity on him, convincing Eric to take him on as an apprentice. But he has another apprentice with the really unlikely name of Buffo, and he discovers that Julie and Mark are in love, and jealously decides to tell his boss. Things then take a pretty drastic turn when a trick goes wrong and Buffo is killed, and fingers start pointing at Mark. But who's to blame? This one is from Pal Fejos, whose name I'm definitely pronouncing correctly. If not, make sure to tell me in the comments. And he was a Hungarian director, and this was his second American film after A Romance Story in 1927. Much like The Last Warning, quite a bit of it was shot on the same set as the one used for The Phantom of the Opera, and was also produced in 2 versions, one with sound and one silent. Most of the reviews were very praising of Veidt's performance, and it wasn't very much appreciated beyond that, although it's said to have done well enough. It's another one where the audio tracks are considered lost, and only the silent film version remains around, which is a shame because apparently the dub for the version that played in Hungary had none other than Bela Lugosi doing the voice of Eric the Great. And this one is decent. It's a 3. I like that it feels like a fresh storyline, but it does feel a little overly long, even at an hour. But I'm also a sucker for things that have to do with magic shows. Its significance is just a 1, though, since it's not talked about or known and didn't really have that many names outside of old Conrad, and didn't quite have the impact of its contemporaries. Should you watch it? Sure, this performance is worth a look. Our next entry arrived on April 28th, and it's yet another one from Benjamin Christensen. and it's House of Horror. Unfortunately, it's another one of his that's lost. This was also partially silent and partially sound, even if the talking sequences were only at the very beginning. This was Christensen's final Hollywood film, and he went back to Denmark for different business ventures. It wasn't well reviewed, although did well enough, and even though the film portions are lost, the audio discs still remain. Next up is one I feel like I've covered so many times already, but in Germany, on August 28th, it's another take on the Hound of the Baskervilles. This version introduces us to Charlie Baskerville, and he's haunted by the sounds of a mysterious hound outside, and legend has it that the family line is cursed by ghosts. After getting a mysterious message from someone named Laura, he heads out into the storm and is killed. We're then introduced to yet another version of that classic detective Sherlock Holmes and his life partner Watson. They're brought onto the case, and it's said that the Baskerville heir, Henry, is headed in, so the boys are assigned to help him out. But the next portion of the film is actually lost, although there's been modern efforts to use stills and a recap to explain what happened within the missing portions. But then, as per the story, Watson is charged with tending to Baskerville while Holmes stays behind in London. Or does he? But yeah, this is now the 5th version of the story that I've discussed on the project. 3 of them were in the 30's project, although one was lost. And there was another one earlier on in the 20's project, but that was also lost. This is the 2nd German version of the story, although this was before the first one I covered, since that was the 1937 version. This particular one was by Richard Oswald again, the same man who did All Wrong, and was unusual in that it used a mostly international cast instead of Germans. Carlisle Beckwell, who was Holmes, was American, and there was also British, Russian, and Italian actors as well. This was actually Oswald's second take on the tale, since he had already done a version back in 1914 in serial form, and this one was heavily praised by critics, but a box office bomb. And even though there were a number of Holmes adaptations in Germany before this one, there wouldn't be another until that 1937 Hound. But then, this one was lost, and even though it was said that there may be a print that existed in the Russian film archive, it appears as if there's no information about that in decades. However, in 2009 in Poland, someone found an incomplete 35mm nitrate print of the film, although it was missing the 2nd and 3rd reels. The film was then restored, and they used a draft of the shooting script to make that missing bridge portion along with the various stills. And I'll go with a 3 here, and I'll say that it's not my favorite go at this story. It's a bit slower and less interesting than the others, but it is really good looking. The number of cool atmospheric shots here are what it's all about. Its significance is just a 1.5, since it is a classic story and the earliest version of it that we can watch, but it's not one of the more well-known ones. Should you watch it? Yes, that's elementary. The decade is winding down now, and we're moving on to September 14th for a film from MGM, and it's The Unholy Night. It begins, and shock of shocks, we have sound, making this the first horror-oriented flick with audio that we can still watch.
Scotland Yard warns everyone not to venture on the streets unless absolutely necessary.
It starts on a foggy dock in London, and a man is attacked, and he goes to the police to recount his story, and he's a rich and stodgy fella. He's told that 5 men were all killed that day, all strangled, like was attempted with him, but it turns out that all the dead men were members of his old regiment from the Indian War. An inspector comes with him back to his house, which he claims is haunted by a green ghost, which was the film's working title.
I never scream unless a fella gets gay with me.
They decide to invite the remaining members of the squad to come to Mr. Montague's mansion in order to try to figure out what's going on, and everyone arrives ready to party with flaming drinks and all, because these guys know how to have a good time. There's some intrigue, including a fake psychic and a quick appearance by Boris Karloff in an uncredited role, and it's the first horror film in which we can hear his voice. But as the night goes on, the crew comes apart as they try to unravel the mystery, And this was directed by Lionel Barrymore, older brother of John Barrymore, and most people knew him as an actor, but he did a little bit of directing as well. He got himself an Oscar, but not for directing, but acting, and in a film called Free Soul that came out in 1931, shortly after this. He's shown up on the project a few times, like back in The Bells, but he showed up in the 30's project more with things like Mark of the Vampire and The Devil Doll, and of course is mostly noted for playing Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. It was based on a short story called The Green Ghost by Ben Hecht, and it was originally going to be directed by Rupert Julian, the director of The Phantom of the Opera. However, he ended up feeling uncomfortable with tackling a full sound picture and dropped out to focus on sound shorts as opposed to feature, with Barrymore stepping in, although it's unsure at what point in production this happened and if any of Julian's footage made it to the finished product. It was given some praise at the time, although others noted that it was too complicated of a script, and some criticized Barrymore's directing style. And this was a little clunkier than others. I'm going to go with a 2.5. It just feels overly drawn out and melodramatic, and it's clear that the actors were getting the hang of sound. Its HCS is a 3 though, since it's our first fully sound feature film that can be put into the horror category. Sure, there were others with sound before this, but not for the whole film, and they're all lost, so this is the first of its kind that remains. Should you watch it? Probably for the idea of watching the first sound horror flick, but honestly, it's a little skippable. Okay, we made it. Our final film of the 1920s arrived on October 5th and was another MGM release with The Mysterious Island, which I'll point out is probably more sci-fi and less horror, but there you go. We learn about the kingdom of Hetvia and this big castle on the island, but there's a lot of unrest amongst the citizens there. It's ruled over by Count Dakar, and I wonder if he wears Drakkar, and it seems as if the whole island is a submerged volcano. And part of the film is silent with intertitles, but there's also segments with dialogue and talking. There's also Baron Fallon, and he talks to Dakar, who is also a scientist, and also Lionel Barrymore, in front of the camera this time around. And he talks about a land that has unknown creatures in it under the sea, and he's built some sort of submarine in order to check it out. Dakar's daughter is helping prepare the ship along with her fiancé, Nikolai, although the Baron disapproves of their relationship because Nikolai is just a commoner and seems interested in her himself, even though he's like 30 years older than her. They set out on a test trip in this adorable toy boat, but then there's treachery as Fallon betrays Dakar and takes over Hetvia. He even tortures them to find out what they know, but we soon find out, and it's a crazy undersea world full of strange creatures, and even a race of people, or the thing from Mac and Me, which I guess was Mac? So this was a pretty experimental project because not only was this one done with some sound sequences, but it was also in color. It was filmed using the 2-color Technicolor process, which is just reds and greens, so it's a more muted tone for everything. It was an expensive and troubled shoot, costing over $1 million to make, and had quite a few production halts that delayed the film by 3 years. Production on this actually began back in 1926 with Lucian Hubbard in the director's chair, and it's his first appearance on any form of the project. But the production took so long that when it was finally released in 1929, there was extra footage shot for incorporation by both Maurice Tourneau and, of course, Benjamin Christensen. It was, however, a bomb and barely made back any of its money, and soon several versions of it became lost. For a while, there was only one color reel in existence, with the remaining all being the black and white ones. But in 2013, a full color print was discovered in Prague and was taken off to be restored, and is now available for view. Of course, I should mention it's also a version of Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a novel from 1875 that has influenced a ton of science fiction. It's a prequel of sorts to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Dakar here is meant to be Captain Nemo. His name is given as Dakar there. It's been filmed a number of times, and this was the first adaptation of it, although there was a 1916 film that had elements of both this story and 20,000 Leagues together, but this was the first one focusing solely on this story. And I enjoyed this, so it's a 3.5 from me, and I mainly love the little duck head guys. Like, I'll admit that I wasn't that into this for the entire first half of the film, and thought it was going to get a lower rating, but as soon as they reach the Undersea Kingdom, things really pick up. Its significance is just a 2.5, since it does get credit for being the first color and sound genre pick, but it's not really that talked about, and didn't make as much of an impact as you'd think. Should you watch it? Sure. Look at this octopus. Why wouldn't you want to see that?